getting them to get that paragraph written and all of these key things. Do they know the basic knowledge and all of that stuff? But what we really wanted was to think about was to put these at the forefront of everybody's minds and give us some new ideas. Knowledge is absolutely essential to us as history teachers. But without these core concepts, cause and consequence, change and continuity, historical significance, similarity and difference, evidence and interpretations, we simply don't have a historical discipline. History is fundamentally about argument, and those concepts provide the focus for those arguments, the element which often provides us with joy when students offer that well-supported point of view or in having a good argument over the message behind different sources. It's the conversations around these concepts that create such engaging and rich lessons and really make our hearts sing as historians and history teachers. So today we will hear approaches for many of those different disciplinary concepts, as well as talking about building narratives. And also we're going to be looking at, Terry Hayden is joining us later this morning to talk about a much forgotten concept of truth within history teaching. A talk I'm particularly looking forward to because I think it's really going to get that old grey matter working hard this morning in terms of thinking. What we're hoping for, and from the sneak peeks that I've had of all these presentations, is that you are going to leave this morning full of different new ideas and approaches and ways of thinking that you can take back to your own faculties, your own departments, and your own students. So without further ado this morning, I'm going to hand you over to our first Teach Meet speaker of the day. This is Oliver Scott. He is going to talk about focusing on students' narrative writing. As historians, often we are building narratives, and how he's improved this through his curriculum through the use of inquiry questions, mapping those key concepts, and showcasing historians' work, and even more. So let's get Oliver on screen, and we can stop listening to me. Good morning, Oliver. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming in on this Saturday morning. And it's a real privilege to present to you all about using first-order concepts and something I've come up with called Story So Far lessons to try and help and improve students' narrative writing. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of my presentation, I thought I would give you a little bit of context to why I've chosen to focus on this today. And this year, for the first time in my career, I was tasked with the very exciting but somewhat daunting prospect of designing a whole year curriculum, and this time a Year 9 curriculum. And there's so much to think about and balance when designing a curriculum. And you're always grappling with that idea. It's never going to quite be done or perfect. You're only ever going to get to that, what I call maybe a tinkering curriculum. And like all of us, I wanted to think about how I can better get students to remember the curriculum that they're being taught. How can I get them to recall information from, say, Inquiry 2 when they're studying Inquiry 7? And one of the reasons I wanted them to remember evidence across these inquiries is so they can write better historical narrative. But I found that this was a little bit of a grey area. Improving students' argumentative writing there's a bit more of a consensus around it. So, for example, outcome task at the end of inquiries, students will think maybe what was the main cause of the First World War, or how much of Anglo-Saxon England survived the Norman conquest, or whether industrialization was felt differently in rural areas to urban areas. That naturally practices their argumentative writing, but their narrative skills are slightly less clear. And I came to the conclusion that actually, in order to improve students' narrative writing, we need to improve their ability to recall information across inquiries and place a premium on remembering stuff from the autumn term in the summer term. And so when designing my Year 9 curriculum this year, I had to grapple with this fact. And one of the ways I've helped improve students' narrative writing, or tried to help them improve their narrative writing, is through what I call these Story So Far lessons. In essence, at the end of each inquiry, students stop for a lesson to think how one of 3 first-order concepts has changed, developed, or in some ways stayed the same across their most recent inquiry compared to previous ones. And through careful reflection of the inquiry and a combination of I do, we do, and you do tasks, they create links between inquiries and use them to explain these developments across the year, with the aim of hoping that they can use this to build narrative across their curriculum and ensure that it sticks a bit better by ensuring they proactively build these links. But these lessons only form part of the process in students' conceptual thinking and drawing on their first order knowledge And so I'm going to take you through this 6-step process today, of which the Story So Far lessons form part of step 5. Now, the first step I actually found is deciding the core first order concepts and the focus that drive your curriculum. I found this blog by one of our speakers today, Sarah Jackson Buckley, really useful, as she begins to improve her students' first order thinking by mapping when students encounter certain first order concepts across their curriculum. I found that actually choosing 3 first order concepts to focus on, these terms that students need to have fluency and a firm grasp of to make sense of the past, like middle class, enslavement, or say authority. I found choosing 3 to focus on is quite a nice number to come back to at the end of each inquiry throughout the year. These first 2 stages are really important in giving the narrative shape and focus. And you've got to do these really carefully, as it eliminates a potential pitfall of perhaps teaching to the first order concept rather than teaching to the inquiry. And you've got to do it in a way that each inquiry means that they will meaningfully encounter at least one first order concept, rather than simply shoehorning topics in to fit a concept. And it allows a curriculum to come at through a different angle, through, say, conquests in year 7, industrialization in year 8, or perhaps ideology in year 9. And it means you can begin to ask different questions of your curriculum through these concepts, in which your narrative will begin to take shape. So, for example, year 9, how have rights changed this year? Or where do we see industrialization happening throughout year 8? Year 7, how have the conquering powers changed from the autumn term now to the summer term? So once we've decided the core first order concepts and the focus, the next stage is to show students why narrative is really important. And this lies in the fact that historians' writing can generally be split into 2 categories. Historians write in an argument, or they write in a narrative, and sometimes they write in a nice mixture of the 2. But we've got to, if we want students to be good historians, we need to get them to try and do what historians do. And to develop good historians, we therefore need to develop their narrative writing skills, as this is the focus of so many historians' work. And I really like this resource by Owen Williams that he uses at the start of year 7, getting students to think about the nature of history and focus on that idea that historians write in these 2 different ways. I use this resource actually at the start of year 9, 10, and year 12 to get students thinking about the nature of history and why narrative is important, and embedding that importance right at the start of the year. Now, the third step in improving these narrative skills is to begin to communicate where your curriculum is driving, or what it's driving towards, or where it's going to students. They need to know what this inquiry is, what this latest piece in the puzzle of this inquiry plays in the wider year. And I found Jacob Oliver's language of reinforcing, introducing, and foreshadowing really useful here, but particularly that idea of reinforcing. If you'd like to see more, he's just posted an updated version of his teaching history article on Blue Sky. But that idea that the reason that you have studied this inquiry is so that we can build on these changing ideas of power, say, from 6 months ago, or we can build on these earlier calls from democracy that you looked at 2 terms ago. And so it begins to get students thinking that we are being taught this with the expectation of remembering it and proactively connecting it to prior learning. And we want them and we expect them to remember details from inquiry 1, say, when we're teaching inquiry 6. The fourth way is to make your lessons driven by narrative. Show and actively use and unpick examples of good historical narrative. This can be done in a number of ways, through using scholarship that is narrative driven and placing these stories and these narratives at the center of each lesson. There's loads of ways we can go about finding these narratives. There's the HA have a list of historical fiction that you can use. I found this thread from Hugh Richards really invaluable, with a collection of teachers' favorite scholarship and narrative use. But my absolute favorite work of historical narrative is the book in the bottom left corner, E.H. Gombrich, A Little History of the World. It's almost written in this slightly paternal style, like your granddad reading you a bedtime story. And it takes us through the history of humanity from the earliest humans right until the First World War. And I use this book quite a lot all the way throughout Key Stage 3. but also we can begin to construct our own narratives that suit our curriculum. Here's one in the top right that I had to go at, looking at Mussolini in the 1934 World Cup. I found Council's presentation at the ArcSoan conference really useful last year. These principles of delaying, heralding, repeating, and not breaking the spell of a story. Really useful for me and grounded me in writing these narratives, but also really good to pick apart these narratives with students. How does this historian keep you interested in this text? What does he do? And begin to analyze that with them. Getting them to think, okay, this is how these historians construct these narratives. The next stage, I think, is where the first order focus pivots from being at the focus of our planning to being at the center and being proactively used by students to help them begin to better construct their own historical narrative. And there's quite a few ways we can use this to help them improve their writing. The first is what I've tried this year, story so far lessons, where students place a first order concept in the center of a double page spread, and they add evidence from their most recent inquiry and build connections across inquiries relating to how this first order concept has changed, developed, or perhaps stayed the same. So almost grounding their thinking in one double page spread to think about how these lessons and how these inquiries are flowing across the year. The second stage, after beginning to tentatively think about evidence that they might add and some early connections, is to make sure their narratives flow. The best stories aren't just isolated events. They're ones that are connected and have this clear start and clear end. And so we began to pick apart how historians do this. I'm going to come back to my favorite narrative bloke, Mr. Gombrich. And I showed students 4 ways that I felt Gombrich began to ensure that his narrative he could make his narrative flow. And so I got them to mimic one of Gombrich's techniques as a task in the lesson to begin to get to link their events. I've also found that planning questions as part of lessons to break up reading or as discussion tasks really valuable in helping students build these narratives. And these questions need to draw on their prior thinking. So, for example, if we've just looked at the Battle of Brunanburh with Athelstan, we could say, well, how does Athelstan's conquest of Britain, how does that differ to Justinian's conquest of Rome that you looked at in Inquiry 1? How does Mussolini's fascist ideology that we've just studied, where does that have lots of similarities to Hitler's extreme nationalism that we looked at in Vienna 2 or 3 months ago? I must admit that sometimes these questions come to me in the moment. And so I found having a departmental Excel spreadsheet where we all just put our questions in that we've planned or that we've thought of that span across inquiries really helpful and really handy. I also think that homework tasks are where students record themselves narrating their narrative, really important as well in beginning to get them to think about how they can construct it after they've added evidence and thought about their links. It almost draws into that Radio 4 show Just a Minute, where if a student hesitates when they're recording themselves, that shows that maybe that's not a bit that they are hugely confident in. And so it's really valuable at getting them to build fluency in their ideas and their argument. It also takes less time. So this homework task might only take them 5 or 10 minutes, but it's helping them build those narrative skills. And finally, after we've worked carefully through steps 1 to 5, now is the time to take the shackles off and give them the chance to write a narrative themselves. And so these story so far lessons, audio recording tasks, time given to think about, say, what the core concept was like at the start of year 9, and mimicking Gombrich's links, all of these act as mini planning tasks for the big task, which is writing this narrative themselves. And so when this came about earlier this year, I gave students the freedom to write without a writing frame and with some simple kind of steps to success on the board rather than this prescribed writing frame. And we picked apart a model paragraph and I left these on the board and I gave them the freedom to choose which first order concept they wanted to focus their narrative on so that they felt a bit more confident. And taking away this writing frame might appear initially quite daunting, but I think it benefited. It's quite daunting, but I think it benefited students because it meant that they could take their narrative in any direction that they pleased. And it benefited students of all attainment levels, and it led to actually a really interesting range of essays. For example, in one class, I read essays that focus on ideology across Year 9. Some of them picked apart the changing nature of nationalism, from patriotism to extreme nationalism to anti-colonial nationalism. Others actually chose to talk about the origins of communism, extreme nationalism, and anti-Semitism that they'd encountered. Whereas other students perhaps chose to focus on what life was like for people on the ground experiencing these ideologies. And I think this range wouldn't have been possible if I'd had a writing frame. I was also struck how this benefited some of the lower attainers in my class as well. Because of the planning tasks that came before, I found their narrative accounts were written with more detail than some of their end of inquiry outcome tasks. And so taking away that writing frame and structuring this narrative lessons in these ways particularly benefited them. At the moment, I do this. My plan is to do this. Well, we did it once just before Christmas, and then once again at the end of the year to think how has their narrative changed from halfway through Year 9 to the end of Year 9. So, for example, at the moment, we're in 1930. So lots of the rights that we've looked at, there's been a regression of rights, and a trend after Christmas will be the progression of rights. And so the narrative account might shift and change. So doing it those 2 points can be quite interesting to perhaps maybe compare the two. And this is what a half decent one looks like. Thinking about what the core concept looked like at the start of Year 9, having lots of precise evidence throughout the essay, mimicking Gombrich's linking themes, but also always coming back to that first order concept, in this case, rights, and keeping that at the center of your historical narrative. I was actually really surprised and impressed at how students linked their answers, and how actually when I was reading their links, if you can quickly read some of these on screen, they were able to mimic in a diluted form some of Gombrich's links. I particularly like the one in the bottom right corner, linking Lenin's Russia under the Tsar, and thinking, although they had different ideologies, using the Tsar to compare the two and say, well, actually, they might just be two sides of the same coin. I thought that was a really lovely way of doing it. But this doesn't mean that there weren't pitfalls. Sometimes I found that students had the opposite problems, where sometimes they would just vaguely discuss the first order concept, and at other times they would just get stuck in the detail and in that narrative description and not tie it back to how that first order concept has changed. Other times I found students just didn't bother linking their events. They would describe an event and then move on to another one. Or their links were really simplistic. Often this tended to fall into this geographical link in the top left corner here, where they would just say, this also happened in this part of the world. So I'm currently at the stage in my planning process around this as how can I minimize these pitfalls next time we plan this again. So a brief reminder, these are the 6 steps to help build that I found have been really handy in helping build historical narrative using these stories so far lessons. Decide those first order concepts that will drive your curriculum. Ensure you keep coming back to why historical narrative is important. Communicate the latest piece in the puzzle with students. We're teaching you this because it reinforces this and it introduces this. Show and actively use examples of good historical narrative. Make those essays narrative driven. Give lots of chances, including story so far lessons, audio recordings, building links to begin to tentatively construct a narrative, and then take the barriers down from the bowling lane and give them a chance to write the narrative itself with the absence of a writing frame. I think there's also some thoughts. This is a very early and tentative idea in my practice, and so there's a lot of thoughts about where this goes next. If these lessons, the big issue is curriculum time trade-off. If these lessons happen at the end of each inquiry, that's 8 lessons across the year. That's 2 inquiries worth. So how do I balance that? How regularly should these lessons take place? If they take place at the end of every other inquiry, would students be able to recall details from, say, at the start of inquiry 3 by the end of inquiry 4? I'm not sure. Is there room to make this a homework task or a cover lesson task when I'm off ill, perhaps by the end of the year when these routines are developed? And balancing I do, we do, you do appropriately. I found sometimes, particularly at the start of the year, lower retainers were parroting what the narrative I saw, and there was a lot of emphasis on the I do and the we do, and perhaps not as much on the you do when we first started this. So yeah, just like to end with a big thank you. If you'd like to get in touch to discuss this more, please reach out to me on X. I'm also using Blue Sky a lot more now as well. And as we can see, a lot of this talk has been me kind of standing on the shoulder of giants. So thank you to such a supportive history community. And a special thanks to Hannah Priory and Cyrus Golding, who helped me draft this, and Owen Brian Williams, who has been really, really vital in building my thinking with this and who I first discussed these lessons with. I hope you all enjoy the rest of today's presentations. They all look incredibly exciting. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ollie. Like, that has been absolutely fascinating. I was just thinking about how when we say we put out the call for disciplinary concepts and then people come and, you know, you've not just shown us a lesson, you've shown us your entire Key Stage 3 and how that approach, and it just blows my mind how differently and how amazingly people are all doing the same, technically these same concepts, but in such amazing different ways. So that has absolutely blown my mind. Also, you have added the first I Must Buy book to my pile from what I'm sure will be made today. So I think I'm going to have to start creating a list of the ones that I'm going to need. And the audio recording idea sounds absolutely amazing in terms of like actually getting a homework, and I was thinking that could work really well. So I'm stealing stuff already. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And you are getting lots of love in the chat as well. So enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye-bye. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. So we are going to move on in just a minute, but just a reminder that if you have got any questions for our speakers, please do pop them in the chat. And the other thing that I just thought was amazing from what Ollie was telling us is all the work and the support of other people in the history community and the work that people just share so willingly. I know the thing that he said he uses at the beginning of year 10 and stuff, I've used this year as well. So we're all clearly borrowing the same ideas. So thank you so much. Next up, we have got Shariza Samtani joining us all the way from the Far East effectively today, and Shariza stood in for us when unfortunately one of our other speakers had to cancel. So thank you so much for stepping in. She is going to talk about change and continuity and how this develops over the different key stages, including some great ideas on how to teach this at those different points. My sneak peek was some that showed me that there are some great ideas to take away from this one as well. So good morning, Shariza. Let me get you on the stage. There we go.
Can you all hear me okay? I hope that's all right. Thank you so much, Emily. So my name is Shariza Wadwani Samtani. I'm a teacher of history and head of EPQ in Harrow, Hong Kong. I do live in Hong Kong, but I'm currently in India. So apologies for any background honking. I will crack right on. Emily, my slides.
They are not here. So I think, there they are. They've just appeared. There
Fabulous,
you go.
sorry. So much. As Emily mentioned, I wanted to look at change and continuity all the way from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 5, but looking specifically at different activities that we can use in the classroom. I think when it comes to these concepts, it sometimes tends to be easier focusing on them at Key Stage 5 and Key Stage 4 with the exam years. But I wanted to kind of show how we can still have these really engaging activities throughout all three key stages. Just as I would do before starting with lessons in class, a quick outline of today. Essentially, how can we get students thinking about change and continuity deeply, and then just looking at some activities. I wanted to start with this quote: "Look for change where common sense suggests that there has been none, and look for continuities where we assumed that there was change." I think the key thing for this for me was looking at challenging assumptions, constantly questioning any preconceived notions that we might have. I think often we take certain events or aspects of life for granted, and I think sometimes students tend to believe that they remain unchanged or they did continue. So I think it's looking in these areas where you might uncover subtle transformations in norms or values or practices that have evolved over time. I think is something else that we should really be reinforcing with our students. And then just a reminder that I use for our students as well, looking at the nature of change and continuity, different areas we can focus on when looking for changes. So social, political, economic, religious, military, and then a reminder to break these down even further. So for economic, for example, it's not just about, which can be connected quite closely to social. So not just about, the economies of countries and trade, but also looking at your individual people as well. And then a quick mention of criteria. So I think students often tend to kind of come to the exam question with preconceived notions of criteria, as opposed to really assessing specific criteria based on their exam question. But again, a nice reminder for students as well that we are thinking about pace or rate of change or continuity, the degree, the extent of change, and the nature and the type, and reminding them of these three areas and how they can best spot this in our lessons. A few different questions to think about. So, what kind of development are we looking for? Assessing the situation immediately before the event that we're looking at, not just what's happening at that time period, looking at what happened right afterwards, short-term, long-term causes of these changes and continuities. I find that often a lot of these concepts are quite intertwined as well. And I think students can have a bit of fun with that too. And then at the very end, looking at what were the reasons that some things remained the same. But I think it really is important to remind them of, what's come up before the event that we're looking at. The first thing I wanted to look at is character profiles. A really fun sort of task that we can do with our students to look at how different people in different areas of society faced varying degrees of change. This is a common Key Stage 3 question for the Norman Conquest that I've taken from, I want to say one of Christine Council's textbooks, but I don't remember right now. So was 1066 a disaster for everyone? The key thing is looking at the experiences of people from different social groups. So you're looking at Saxon peasants, you're looking at Saxon and Norman lords, you're looking at Saxon monks, for example. So through the different experiences of these different people, you can touch on change to do with religion, to do with military, to do with social, depending on which character you're doing a deep dive into. Some examples of activities, diary entries. So whether you have students write a diary entry from the perspective of their person pre and post the Norman Conquest, or whether you choose to give them character profiles, perhaps as you go through the course. So this textbook activity that I've taken and run with, as we look at the Harrying of the North, for example, we look at Peasant Brum, I think he was called, to really understand how the Harrying of the North affected your Saxon peasants in the north. So you're learning about that time period with a focus on an individual, and then towards the end you can really put together all these profiles and plot them on a continuum that looks a little bit like this. I've got one of my students' examples here. So essentially on a continuum, or a living graph if you will, on a scale of complete and total disaster to total success, they can then, once they have these little boxes, they can mix or sort of move them around before deciding, okay, now that I've looked at all of these different people, who do I think had the worst time, or who do I think took out the most from this time period? Looking also at Key Stage 5 and how we can look at character profiles or diary entries, which I think is something that we often tend to forget because we're just so focused on getting through the spec. So for Key Stage 5, I look at, I think it's course 1E for EdXL, Lenin to Yeltsin. And so we look at change of continuity from the entire time period from 17 to 85. One of our themes is looking at social. So we look at women, we look at the role of family, the family unit. So I give students a bit of time to do some core reading, and then I allocate each of them one particular, well, they all become women in different time periods, and essentially they have to write their own tweet talking about the different experiences, whether they're talking about work or motherhood or marriage and divorce, or war. You know, some of these rulers were extremely pragmatic. You take Stalin, for example, who was extremely inconsistent, particularly pre and during war. So a little sort of tip that I remind students all the time: when you're looking for changes, you're not only looking at change between the rulers, but also within them, to really find those sort of peaks or low points of consistency. Another way of doing character profiles are, I have these top secret profiles to look at control, and looking at how the secret police or the use of terror affected different people in society as well. You know, so to help students really think of a more nuanced conclusion to a question such as, to what extent were Soviet leaders consistent in their policies or in their use of the secret police? You know, one method of measuring how consistent they were is looking at different groups of people. So whether they look at a religious perspective through the Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow, whether they're looking at artists or authors, it just gives them a nice, fun way of doing this. And whether you dish them out as character cards that you create yourself, whether you have them half filled in and have students fill in the rest based on their reading, and then start to put them in order. It can be a 5-minute task. It can be a 10-minute task. It can be a prep. It can be an entire lesson. You know, super, super flexible. And a bit of top secret CIA in the background too. These character profiles, I think, lead quite nicely into the next idea that I had, looking at living graphs. I admit none of these are new ideas, but I just think it was a nice reminder that, you know, how we can reuse them. Living graphs, so great for exploring patterns or trends over long periods of time. So I give my students a template that looks a little bit like this. For this question, we're looking at how consistent were Soviet attitudes towards religion. And it plots two things. So you can plot different policies, different legislations, different events that have happened for each ruler. And then you, depending on how much control they showed that ruler had, or how little control that ruler had, they can sort of position them higher or lower. Once this has actually been put together, it creates really nice patterns, and you can really all of a sudden see. Now, this one is actually not for religion, this was for art and culture. But from this, you can already see that there's a lot of legislation that was highly restrictive based on this one example. But even though there are not as many policies that show a lot of freedom when it comes to art and culture, they were quite severely free or less restrictive. So when students are looking at planning an essay, for example, based on a living graph like this, they can already quite easily visually see different conclusions that they could draw. Whether they decide to say that the use of art and culture was consistently restrictive, despite the fact that there were some points of thought or some points of freedom, or they say that they were completely inconsistent or extremely inconsistent, because even though there were only a few thought points, they were extreme points of freedom. So it gives them a nice sort of visual understanding. Again, it could be a 5-minute brain dump before you plan an essay or at the start of a lesson. It can be a way of them restructuring their notes for a homework task. It can be an entire lesson. It can be a paired task. Perhaps you have students make one of these and then you do a bit of pairing where, I beg to differ because one person argues for, one person argues against, and they have to battle it out. So much you can do or take from just one sheet of A4 paper, which I think is quite powerful. I've got another example here. I apologize, I know it's quite small. This was another student example looking at the role of terror. And again, you can either just have your key policies or your key events written down, or bulk it up, add a bit of supporting evidence, and turn this into a revision task or a worksheet. So many different options. Another quick task that a student of mine had put together really, really briefly. I think this was like a 15-minute one. So again, you're dividing it between Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. Yes, great for IB/DP teaching as well as A-level for sure when you're looking at long periods of time, or you're going to be comparing different rulers as well. Venn diagrams. I'm not a math person by any means, although a lot of our students do take math. And I think a visual representation, again, can be quite handy. This I use a lot more with my year 10 and 11 students. So we look at Russia and the Soviet Union for the IGCSE course. And they tend to get confused between causes or features of the 1905 and the 1917 revolutions. So quite simply, they make a Venn diagram showing similarity and differences, differences on both sides, and then similarities in the middle. And again, I give them some sort of tips. So we're looking at causes or course or effects, and they can bullet point them on either side of the Venn diagram and then really easily see what features did both revolutions have in common. It also helps to pinpoint, what did we have happen in Feb 1917 that did not exist in 1905? One of the key things that comes out is the fact that in 1917, the Tsar did not have support of the army, for example, which is actually not on this Venn diagram. But it also helps to pick out the most significant causes of the revolution, the most significant cause of the Tsar's abdication, alongside comparing the two revolutions, which also ended up addressing misconceptions. So this was a really a simple task that turned into a whole bunch of stuff. And I can already see this being used in Key Stage 3 as well if you want to do pre and post Norman Conquest. There's so many ways that this can be used. Again, a quick task, a short task, a longer lesson. You could have them to make notes based on a Venn diagram if that's what they wanted. Quick and good for revision as well. The last one I wanted to quickly look at are tables, just going back to basics. I use tables a lot with my Key Stage 5 and also Key Stage 3 students. This is an example of one that I use for Key Stage 4, looking at conflict in the Middle East. So we look at 5 key conflicts, and this task sort of helps students really consolidate their knowledge, put down key details. But the last 2 rows are what I really want to look at. One of the key questions or the focus points of this course is change and continuity. And students are having to really pull out key changes and continuities quite quickly in an exam setting. And I feel like they tend to struggle quite a lot. And I thought the best way to prepare them for this is put out all the information that you know. Look at what happened before your conflict. What have you inherited before you look at what's actually going on? And the last 2 rows here I've filled in. A student of mine had done this for me. Looking at key areas of change for territorial change, population change, political change. You're going back to those different aspects of nature of change. These are also key sections on the exam spec as well. But again, I think once the table is complete, it ends up being a cheat sheet for them. It ends up being easier for them to pick out these changes after having all of these rows filled in and really looking at their conflicts from a wider perspective, like taking a step back.
I think that's great in terms of like the big ideas, Shariza, definitely. I'm going to have to call it there so that we don't run too much time. But thank you so much. I've literally just written down, use the Venn diagram for the difference between the 1923 hyperinflation and the Great Depression, because my year 10s are really getting confused with that in our Germany and the IGCSE. So, and you are getting loads of love for A-level. You tend to think of these key concepts, these disciplinary concepts, right back at Key Stage 3, but I think what you've really highlighted is how brilliantly they work the whole way. Shariza's PowerPoints, along with everybody else's, and the recordings will all be sent out after today's session has ended. So they will all be available at the end. If you check out our socials, you will get there. Thank you so much, Shariza. Brilliant. And again, thank you so much for stepping in at such short notice.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Okay, so what we are going to be doing now is we are going to be hearing from Terry Hayden. So many of you will have been trained by Terry at UEA, myself included. So if you are listening here, we have got 189 people watching live. So if you are listening here and was trained by Terry, then please say hello in the chat. And I'm super excited to have him speaking here today for us. So welcome, Terry. Oh, you are muted. Let's make sure we can hear you. There you go.
Right.
Perfect.
Can I stress that I'm completely in favour of teaching the second order concepts, change, cause, significance, etc. I think they're very important. I just think that truth is also an important concept in history, and it gets a bit neglected. Some of the slides are very dense. I don't expect you to read them. It's just if you're interested in anything, you can pick it up later. So I'm going to tentatively suggest that in school history in England, limited attention has been paid to the ethical importance of making an honest attempt to provide the most accurate explanation possible from the evidence available. In the national curriculum, it's never been a key concept or a key element, in spite of the fact that respect for evidence is a central tenet of history. And interestingly, I would argue there's no mention of truth in the national curriculum of history. It's just not there. I remember coming across this quote by Hobsbawm way a long time ago in 2002. I mean, we've always had bad history. We've always had people stoking up hate and fear of the other in history, going back to Bismarck and the Reich is in danger, the socialists, the Poles, the Catholics, the stab in the back legend that Hitler used, more recently the Great Replacement theory. So there's always been bad history and people stirring up hatred against outsiders. But two things have changed since Eric Hobsbawm said that in 2002. The first is the amplification effects of social media. I first came across this through John Simkin, who mentioned that at a debate at the Oxford Union or the Cambridge Union, he was debating against an eminent historian of the Weimar Republic. And John said to this historian, well, your books have sold 300 copies this year, according to Amazon. My webpage on the Weimar Republic's been looked at by several 100,000 people. Now, John's a respectable historian, stroke history teacher, and interested in history of education. That's all right. But of course, not all the stuff on social media is as wholesome as that. And now you're getting really bad, evil statements about history that are utterly untrue, amplified millions of times within a day. So it's become more important. And the other thing is the slide into the post-truth era. There've been changes to the idea of truth, and it was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016, and it defined it as the appeal to emotion rather than reason and evidence, and that's become much more prevalent, and it's become much more socially acceptable to lie. People can lie regularly and still become eminent politicians. There was a time when if you caught lying, you had to resign. And people don't seem to mind being lied to now. Sometimes it's about, oh, but there'd be a nice person to go for a drink with. Just out of interest, this thing about getting across to pupils that sometimes arguments are based on emotion. There's a great clip by Paula White, who was Trump's media, a spiritual advisor. And it's just a YouTube clip of her making a very emotional appeal. It's just a very strong example of the appeal to emotion rather than reason. So for these two reasons, amplification and the slide into the post-truth era, I think it's more important than ever that we educate pupils about the differences between good and bad history. Of course, there's two elements to that. Sometimes history is bad because it's inaccurate or it's founded on ignorance. So Donald Trump's claim that the Revolutionary Army took over the airports in the American Revolutionary Wars is obviously bad history of a different type. But a lot of it is lack of sincerity, people knowingly lying for unethical purposes. And that's what we need to teach our pupils to recognize, because it's important. So you get this simplification of the past. what Sarah Churchwell calls the Disneyfication of history. It gets simplistic, and you get, politicians trying to use the past sometimes for present day purposes. There are pressures on politicians to get elected, to get their policies across, and sometimes they will try and use history to justify their intentions and purposes. I think a good example of this is Bill Cash's claim that World War One, let's get it right, Germany started World War One. Because Max Hastings, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson will all say so. Germany started. So a really good example of selective citation, a term that kids should learn, this cherry picking of evidence. And of course, if you look at the historical record, it's rather more complex than that. And the other thing is kids should become with the idea of familiar with the idea of scholarly authority, that Jeremy Paxman probably doesn't know as much about World War One as Christopher Clark. So just to get them to think about what are the credentials in terms of believing what somebody says about past. Now, this isn't a party political point. I'm trying to make people should learn that politicians are often under pressure to use the past for their own purposes. So again, you get this oversimplification of the past in order to justify your position. And sometimes it can be very cleverly done, and I think it can be helpful to show kids examples of well done, clever bad history. This is a really good clip. You can get it on YouTube. It's called How Americans Live Today, and the link's there. And it's just, it's very funny. It only takes 3 or 4 minutes, but it's the sophistication with which you can falsify the past and the present. So I don't think you'd have a hit series of lessons on truth. It's a bit like chronology. You'd work a bit in here and there. When you come across an example of bad history, you just mention it in passing, and you'd explain why it's bad and the context and the reasons behind it and how it works, how it's done, the games that are being played with history by different forces. Different sort of bad history. It's also a very good example of astroturfing, a site not being what it purports to be. The Reagan Revolution, and this is just brilliantly bad. The music itself is absolutely awful. It's only 1 minute, and it's funny, and it would give kids an insight. And then if you just explain that this site is not a dispassionate, if you look at the about bit of the website, it's got historians and universities, how we check our content. And then if you look at the mission statement, it's about taking pride in Americans' past, patriotic history, the role of God in American history. They had to found this site because of left-wing teachers who were unpatriotic. And you become aware it's financed by Mike Huckabee and Republican politicians, and it's not neutral, it's not dispassionate history. Again, this is from the New York Times only a couple of weeks ago. The January the 6th riots, described by the president as a day of love. And the New York Times article, it's quite a long feature about how over 3 or 4 years, with the investment of millions of dollars, repeating and repeating and repeating the same thing, and the amplification effects of news channels and social media, you can get this almost Orwellian distortion of the past. And kids need to be made aware of these things. This is Ali Messer showed me this. It's a BNP poster from the London elections, showing the top picture, all white London in 1946, 1948, all white street party, all happy, all smiling. Don't have to lock your door. Your kids can play out safely with London today. And there's these 3 women in burqas putting a V sign up. Well, actually, that's not an accurate representation, is it? London wasn't all white in 1946. There's always been a mix of ethnicities in London. And to just sometimes point out that sometimes the history that's presented to them, because not all our pupils realize this, they're not all in on the game. Some of them are taken in by it. So we need to prepare them for bad history. This is the commemorative koan that a popular newspaper made to celebrate Britain's victory over Europe in 1945, as if, and there are American senators saying that the war against socialism in 1945. So every day you're coming across these grotesque distortions of history, and we need to educate our kids about these things. And it's so important because a lot of the bad things that happen in the world are done by people who are very clever, who did well in history at school, and have high level qualifications in history, and are very skillful at handling evidence in the sense of cleverly manipulating and distorting it. There was this great quote by Keith Jones about the need to take seriously the need to pursue truth on the basis of evidence. And that's got an important bearing on the health and vitality of civic society. And also, just over time, a bit at a time, develop their understanding of the factors that can compromise or militate against truthfulness, the pressures on veracity. Sometimes it's just done for humour, like Blackadder, or it's a polemic where you exaggerate one side, or for money, will it sell? Bad history says, say something controversial. Hitler is alive and living in South America. History sells. That'll get loads of, it's clickbait. It will get loads of advertising. Or to tell a nice feel-good story about in the Blitz, everybody worked together, our island story, or a heroes and villains story like Braveheart. Munich Crisis, World War II, much used at the time of Brexit, decided that Britain alone defeated the tyrannies of Europe, as if the Red Army and America had nothing to do with it. Sometimes it just gets you attention and publicity. Or to tell a nice, cheerful, positive story. No need to worry about climate change. It's just a hoax. It's just fake news. And it's not accurate to say that things are either true or false. It's more complex than that. So you can think of a scale of veracity that sometimes it's historians who are absolutely scrupulous, very careful, very calibrated in their claims. And other historians are a bit fast and loose because they like telling a bit of a racy tale. And then there's the cherry picking, and then there's the conscious elision of evidence that doesn't conform. And then there's the utterly shameless manipulation of the past. And again, important to delineate between incompetent historians and dishonest ones. Susanna Lipscomb said, you can't be a historian and a liar. Well, sadly, that's not true. Look at these historians. So we've got David Irving, David Starkey, Chris Clark, Ian Kershaw, Niall Ferguson, Richard Evans. And if you think about them, you probably have an image of your head as being, some are a bit more cautious and measured, and others are prone to come out with, quite spectacular claims. And let's say something controversial, School of History. You might remember David Starkey saying that the SNP were Nazis. And a bit of the evidence was how similar the Scottish flag was to the swastika. Is that strong evidence? And this has implications for how we teach the national past, which is still an important part of the national curriculum. One of my interests has been studying what politicians say about school history, and they often say things that aren't, I think, very helpful. Why can't we go back to the good old days where we learnt by heart the names of kings and queens and the feats of our warriors? It's interesting to know that Labour historians have also come out with this. Gordon Brown, Jack Straw, Tony Blair have all really trumpeted this idea of celebratory history and the idea that it's social cement. You're telling a nice positive story of the national past will bind us all together and make us all a bit like that Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson track, wasn't it? Ebony and Ivory, living in harmony on the piano. But it's not accurate history. The other fairy story is the Chief Inspector's statement that Britain's, always been a beacon of fairness and tolerance. Well, if you look at the historical record, whether it's, the Jews, the Huguenots, the Germans, the Poles, the Eastern Europeans, the Windrush generation, the boat people, that's not accurate. And I think the reason it doesn't work anyway is because in an open society, kids will realize that it's not completely true and that not being told the truth. It's an unexamined assumption that if you teach an unreservedly positive version of the past, then kids will be, nicer, better citizens. We're not the only country where there's this attempt to tell a positive story about the national past, but there are other approaches. And one important thing to keep in mind is that school history shouldn't be just about the national past. Many of the difficult issues that face us are transnational in their nature. In the 19th century, perhaps nations were very important, but think of the challenges that face us today. And it does say on page 1 of the national curriculum that children should learn about the challenges of their times. Now, just ask yourself, look at the national curriculum as it's currently formulated. To what extent do they learn about the challenges of our times? About climate change and resource depletion, pollution, and the inequality, the many transnational issues that affect society. I mean, what keeps you awake at night? Is it the British Empire and kings and queens of England and statues? It isn't, is it? There are other issues which we should focus on. And so by deflecting people into just thinking of national agendas, they're not. And some people would argue this is a deliberate distortion. So we don't think about issues like why rich people don't always pay their fair share of tax, and why pollution happens, and why climate change gets ignored. And the other thing is what's called critical patriotism. This is Neil MacGregor, who points out that in Germany, they built in the capital city a massive monument to the worst thing the Germans ever did. And he says that, the Germans have more recently been honest about their past and acknowledged the skeletons that most countries have. And in Belgium, the new museums about colonialism in Belgium. There's a good quote by Edward Said in a program on Holocaust museums. People ought to be able to have direct knowledge of the horrors that can be unleashed on people in the name of race, nation, or religion, but not so that we can feel superior and say, well, the Germans did that. The next step is to ask, what is it that we did? Because every people do it in its history to others, weaker or the wrong colour. That's the lesson of it. And I've argued elsewhere that most countries have their skeletons, and it's more intelligent history education policy to acknowledge that, to say, well, yeah, like all other nations, we've made our mistakes. The greatest patriotism is to tell your country when it's behaving dishonorably, foolishly, viciously. And of course, most countries have got something of that nature. This is just some references that might be of use, either just to give to your pupils or to use one or two in class. Part of it, of course, is about a cognitive thing. It's about teaching kids to use the internet responsibly and intelligently. That there's more to provenance than, is it a primary or a secondary source? And we haven't all got time to read Weinberg and Caulfield and Weinberg's books, but there's no shortage now of shorter guides, which in 3 or 4 minutes sum up the SIFT protocol for assessing the veracity of web materials. And maybe to just take 4 minutes out of a lesson. I know it's difficult covering all the content that we've got to cover, but it's so important that kids can learn to discern between good and bad history when they encounter it outside the classroom. And in a few minutes, these resources just show you the Stanford History Education's research and the use of what fact checkers and Wikipedia editors do to get at the truth, and the idea of lateral searching. But it's not just a cognitive thing, it's partly an ethical thing. I thought there's a great Arthur Chapman blog about narrative ethics, saying we need to teach our kids to be responsible in their use of history and in their consumption of history, to think about the positive and negative effects that stories can have on their audiences, about the sorts of story we should and should not tell, and we should and should not credit, promote and share, the disposition that they should feel they ought to tell responsible stories, and their aversion towards irresponsible stories and storytellers, and their caution before accepting some incendiary claim about the past or the present. It's what Peter Lee has called cognitive ethics: respect for truth, respect for evidence. So it's not just a cognitive thing, it's actually an ethical thing, that ought to be part of our history teaching. And of course, it's not just about historians and politicians. It's the difference between good and bad journalists, good and bad scientists, good and bad researchers, good and bad human beings. Truth is a civic virtue. And in this post-truth era, we've perhaps lost sight of that a bit, that truth is a good thing. Societies that adhere to truth and have a concern for truth are generally better than the societies where truth has sadly collapsed or been neglected. A little self-examination is necessary here. We all have our little biases and prejudices. I remember sometimes I've used pieces of research that are very useful because they back up what I want the students to learn, and I haven't looked for corroborative studies and things like that because I like what the research says. We've just got to, how often have you changed your mind about things? I did a talk once and I gave people a postcard and asked them to write down how many times they'd changed their opinion on something, and there weren't that many answers. Great quote by Andrew Miller, the novelist: "It's difficult to change the way you see the world. We take a certain view when we're young, and then we spend the rest of our lives collecting the evidence." There's only one syllabus, as far as I'm aware, that teaches kids about the importance of having an open mind. That's the IBAC syllabus, which explicitly teaches kids to try and develop the proclivity of having an open mind. Especially important now we're living in our little tribes of identity on Facebook and X and Blue Sky. Just occasionally it surfaces in documentation, Ofsted 2005, using evidence critically and with integrity, practical wisdom, a predisposition, and it is a disposition as much as anything, a habit, a tendency to tend to think, I ought to try and find out the truth about this. I ought to play the truth, to say the truth about this. And although politicians don't always say helpful things about history, important not to generalise. I thought there's a great quote by Keith Joseph, who was Secretary of State of Education at the same time as John Slater was the Chief Inspector. The teaching of history has to take place in a spirit which takes seriously the need to pursue truth on the basis of evidence. That, to me, is the important message of what I'm trying to say. And yes, history properly taught hopefully can make a bit of a difference and reduce sort of foolhardy prejudice and instincts to violent reprisals when kids read incendiary things on the net. But of course, there are limits to what school history can do. It's up against, in some cases, billions of dollars of money. You know, A Day of Love thing was backed by millions of dollars. It isn't just historians who write history. It's, corporations and media oligarchs. They write history as well. So, it does, as John Slater says, it enables our loyalties to be moderated by informed and responsible skepticism. You're not being a traitor or a Marxist if you're critiquing British history. But we must be aware that it can't guarantee tolerance. It can help it, maybe. It just might nudge people to being a bit more open-minded. But it's hard. But I suppose the reason I say it matters is if you look at the state of the world today, just think of what things are like in various bits of the world today. And the torrents of hate and lies and distortions on Facebook and Twitter, and think, well, actually, we've got to pay more attention and give more time to getting our students to be concerned about being truthful and acting with integrity. There's a vocabulary to this. It always worries me when people don't know and understand the word astroturfing. It seems to me very basic, or that, you know, playing the race card, doxing and trolling, clickbait. These are all part of digital and civic literacy now. So by the time they reach the age of 16, you know, kids should understand these important concepts. You know, what populism is, what realpolitik is, the manufacture of consent, playing the race card, and so on. And, you know, giving them have quotes about truth on the wall. Regularly pick out examples of bad history and good history, explaining why it's good, in the same way that an English teacher would explain why Shakespeare writes well. That you give them something by a respectable historian with a measured, calibrated conclusions, acknowledgement of uncertainty, sort of reasonably succinct and clear conclusions, and so on, so they can learn to tell the difference between good and bad history. And again, I just think this quote from Keith Joseph way back 1984, I just think that is a really good example of a politician talking or writing thoughtfully about the potential of school history to get kids to make intelligent judgments in the light of evidence and in the light of the facts, rather than accept the distortions and lies that are so prevalently out there. So I think that's it. Thank you for listening. Sorry if it was a bit of a rush. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Now, I don't know about everybody else out there, but that was just as thought-provoking as I thought it was going to be, and has really got me considering different elements this morning. I think the whole key point there is that there are scales, there are layers of truth, there are layers of history, and it's about us thinking about actually what does make good history when we're reading history. If we are teaching our students how to write like historians, if we are teaching our students to do history, to study the past, to write about it, then we need to have key elements that do make good history. And can they go out there and recognize those things in a world where, with my IGCSE Global Perspectives kids, we are looking at can you keep yourself safe online? And they've been introducing me to the world of deep fakes and AI fakes and stuff, and the clickbait. And it's important that they can absolutely recognize what that concept of the truth and what does make something reliable and what doesn't, so that they are literate when they leave our hands. So thank you so much, Terry. So insightful, so brilliant. If you have got any questions, then just pop those in the chat for us. But thank you so much for giving up your time again. And there was so much love for you from former students as well on the chat whilst you were talking. So still having such a huge impact on history teachers all over the country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this morning, our next our next speaker is going to be Rachel Cliff, who is going to talk about change and continuity again, but a very different approach to that Shariza took earlier on. This time, Rachel is talking about getting students to think about the degrees of change. So not just those examples of what is change and what is continuity, but the degrees of change. So really going into the nuance and the depth of this. Just a little shout out again, if you are free on the 1st of March and want to come and join us at Teachers Talk Connect, Teachers Talk Radio Connect, then please do come and join us. We also have a couple of speaking slots left. So if you are inspired today, then please do come along. You can sign up to speak on the Teachers Talk Radio website. There's a little form there that you fill in. We would love to have you. And it doesn't matter what you want to talk about. We are willing to give you that platform to be able to have those different conversations and show us your amazing ideas, just like all of the teachers today. So without further ado then, Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much. Oh, there you go. My glamorous assistant has put you on.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a lovely Saturday morning. I am Rachel Cliff. I'm a history teacher up in Leeds. And as Emily said, I'm speaking today about focusing more on the change aspect of the disciplinary concept, and thinking when students are looking at change, has everything changed? And well done to any of the Swifties that have spotted the reference there to the Taylor Swift song, because I wanted to slide that in. Now, this PowerPoint is building on Sharice's. There's a few little crossover ideas, but hopefully it gives it just a different perspective and look at change. Now, when we're thinking about change then, the Oxford Dictionary definition of change, it is much simpler than the 1980 definition of change for history teachers. And that is the long definition there from Schmidt, which is one of the more kind of regarded definitions of change as a second order concept, a disciplinary concept in history. And I've pulled out some of the key features from that. And it's this idea that change in history can be ongoing, it can be long term, it can be quick, it can be sudden change, it can be gradual. There can be multiple changes occurring at once in history. There can be periods of rapid change, then periods of gradual change. And change doesn't have to be positive. And I think that's a really key one, because sometimes students really do focus on the positives and not always those negative changes that happen. I think the other complexity with teaching change is it often overlaps with other disciplinary concepts in history. So when you're asking a question like, why did X change? Yes, you are looking at change, but actually it's a causation question, because you're looking at, well, why did this change? Or how did something change? Could be a consequence question as well. Now, personally, for me, I don't see an issue with the disciplinary concepts combining in inquiry questions. But I think it's about reflecting and acknowledging this within the teaching and finding ways to either isolate change as a disciplinary concept within lesson activities, adapting inquiries, or lessons that just focus solely on change, and just having that awareness of it within your curriculum and your inquiry planning. Because I think sometimes it's very easy as you map out a curriculum to just put change and continuity or causation and change, and that's okay, but just having that awareness, it's within some of those questions. And we're going to look at how we can word questions and look at questions to focus just more on change. Now, taking that definition from Schmidt, then, he summarized 3 different types of historical change, which can be used to frame inquiry questions. And I want to look at these in turn and kind of look at some lesson activities and ideas around them on how we can support students then to see these different degrees of change. So firstly, the pace or rate of change. So how quickly and slowly does change happen in certain periods of history? The degree or extent of change. So how much change has happened? And then finally, the nature or type of change. So could it be positive or negative? Is it economic change, social change, political change? What type of change is happening? So if we start with pace or rate of change, personally, my favorite way is through graphs and that visual kind of look at pace or rate of change. And I've put 2 examples on here that I've done with students this year that look at pace or rate of change, but for different reasons. So the first one is from a GCSE lesson. I teach the OCRB specification. And the reason we did it is to look at the gradual change over the period of 1750 to 1900 for students to see that the industrial government at that time were making changes. It was happening gradually and it was building and building and building. And there were some turning points within that, but actually seeing that progression over time. Whereas the second graph was us looking at World War II, and we were looking from 1939 to 1943. We just studied the Battle of Stalingrad, and we were looking at how the conflict had changed for different countries and how there were these moments of real rapid change for some countries, but also steady change for others. And you can see there it's very up and down, and it was getting students to see how those different events were changing the success rate in the war for World War II. And at the top there's some question stems. So things like how quickly when did X develop most rapidly? When did Y gain momentum? And looking and using those questions to develop students thinking about the pace or rate of change. And I would say that this activity, and I know Shariza spoke about it with the living graphs, is something that I think to build students, that we did the one on World War II, we did that as a class and we had students contributing and it was a discussion. Whereas the one on the left, students did independently and they added their own learning to it as we went. We modelled the first one, but they did that very much on their own. So I think the more you're using these with students, the more confident they'd be with doing it independently. The degree or the extent of change then. So looking at how far has something changed. And I'm going to speak in a moment about vocabulary with this because I think that's really important. We can see here again, my preference is very much scales. So I've got a bit like a changeometer on the left. So it's going from no change to drastic change. And this again was a Key Stage 4 lesson looking at living conditions and how much they had changed in that period. And it was looking at a comparison between the early modern and the industrial period, because it's the people's health topic for the OCRB unit. And you can see students here are able to plot on, right, well, no change for the poor and their food. The poor and the food was very, very similar. But you can see there was a drastic change. Sorry, actually, this is medieval and early modern because it's the rich food due to trade. I've just read it. So there was a drastic change for the rich because they started to have the luxuries from the imports that were coming in. So they were able to put in there the differences between the rich and the poor and how much change was actually happening in that period. Because for the poor, they'll notice there wasn't much. Okay, there was little change, no change, some change. But for the rich, there was significant and drastic changes to their living conditions. And then the classic thermometer for the Cold War on the right, but just showing again that is showing the nature of change and those tensions over time and plotting on how those events changed the tensions. So questions like how far did X change, or have attitudes changed? Okay, how much changed, how much stayed the same? Okay, but focusing again on the element of change. And then finally, the nature or the type of change. So on the left here, colour coded, I personally think works really well for this. You've got a grid. This is actually from my Year 7 scheme of work on the Crusades. This was created by my wonderful head of department, Mr. Aitken. And you can see here, you've got at the bottom, I know it's probably quite small, it looks at the Crusades and how much the Crusades changed the world. So it does bring in consequences as well. But looking there at economic changes, military changes, social changes, political changes. So looking at the types of change that the Crusades had and then evaluating obviously that impact as well. I've put another activity on there that I like, which is using the emojis. So thinking of this idea of positive and negative change, but from different perspectives, and thinking of how that change has happened and getting them to justify and explain that change. So focusing, as Teresa said earlier, on kind of those different perspectives. So how much has changed. In this instance, it was a World War II one. So looking at for British perspective, German perspective, the Russian perspective in there as well. And I've just used those really simple emoji faces to get them to see that sometimes the changes, because of the Battle of Stalingrad, varied from different perspectives and varied in terms of the nature of that change as well. So again, there's some question stems on there that you can use to question students or to support with lesson activities or even inquiry planning. Now, further lesson activities. Interestingly, I put the writing narratives on before I saw Ollie's presentation this morning, but I think that builds in really well for asking students to write narratives about changes. This could allow students to consider again those different perspectives and the degree of change. I've said it could be quite a creative task, but I have obviously put the caution note on there to be quite sensitive about the topic choice for that type of task if it is a letter to a friend or a diary entry. But thinking about writing that narrative about what's changed and how it's changed and how it's different there. I mentioned again already using interpretations to show change. There's an example there from the Teaching History article I'm going to reference at the end. It's taken from Mohammed and Whitburn's How Did Interpretations of Great Zimbabwe Change During the 20th Century? And looking at two different historians' perspectives on that to show change. The Hopeless Historian task is from the Understanding Key Stage 3 history book, but that's where students rewrite a generalised historical statement to provide evidence and support. So it's giving them a basic statement on change, like living conditions changed a lot during the industrial period. Well, develop that into a paragraph. How can they rewrite that and improve it to tell us about change? And then finally, scaling down the focus of change. So looking at and zooming in maybe one village or one person's life, how that changed over a period. And I know there's the brilliant EAM case study on the Black Death. Very quickly, my last slide, building vocabulary around change. The presentation's being sent out, but I've just put here some language that students can use as a bit of a vocabulary bookmark for writing about extended writing tasks around change. And those are hopefully some of the key takeaways and some of the references from this presentation.
Thank you so much. Again, some brilliant things to take away there, and people's generosity today has been brilliant. So we're just so grateful for everything that you are doing. I love the way that there are so many different approaches, because obviously 2 of you have spoken about change and continuity, but looked at completely different things, which has been brilliant. The thermometer, when I sort of saw the sneak preview of your presentation, I was like, I'd forgotten about using like a thermometer for the changeometer. And I was like, it's a really easy visual way for students to give a judgment and back it up. So that's definitely something I'm going to be bringing back in, especially because I think for discussion, I'm trying to work on a bit of an oracy focus at the moment. So like if you've got the thermometer as the starting point, and then them having to justify why, I think that would work brilliantly. So yet again, another brilliant set of resources. And your vocab bookmark, I am sure, we'll be seeing in classrooms up and down the country.
Thank you. Well, hopefully it's just something I didn't want people scribbling down, so I tried to condense it. And I will credit Hugh Richards is credited on there, because I did take a lot of some of the vocab from his brilliant display. And please check it out.
It is a great display if you guys don't already have it. So thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
So all of these ideas that we've had so far today, loads of really practical things to get us thinking as history teachers, all of these things, these are the reasons why I keep coming back to history conferences and history teach meets. These are the reasons why I really push myself to get out there and do them, and why I now help organise them. So remember, you can get more of this amazing stuff at our Teachers Talk Teachers Talk Radio Connect event on the 1st of March. As I said, although you might be thinking, oh, well, it's, for lots of different subjects, history have a full day planned. Myself and Claire will be there to run the history strand for the day, and we have got a full day of speakers. So it is absolutely worth your while to come and join us at that event. Some brilliant main speakers, lots of teachers coming to speak as well, some of whom were in the audience at our September event and have now been brave enough to sign themselves up to actually speak at our March event. If you are thinking that you could speak, or you've got a great idea to share, or you know somebody who does, then please point them in our direction as well. We have got further events coming up throughout the year, and so we can organise somewhere for you to speak. So Sarah and Jessie are going to speak for us now. They're going to explain one of their inquiries where they have placed sources really at the heart of it. So focusing on the evidence side of our disciplinary concepts today. It is called Gaps in the Archive, Hearing the Voices from an 18th Century Slave Plantation. And I don't know about you guys, but when I hear about hearing the voices, I always think putting the voices of those people we are studying at the front and centre of our history is always an amazing experience. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Hopefully Jessie will be there shortly. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Jackson Buckley, and Jessie hopefully will be joining us very shortly. We both teach at Salisbury Village College in Cambridgeshire. And we're going to talk to you today about our inquiry that's based around this gaps in the archive that Emily already mentioned. So just to get us started, I thought I'd just explain the context of the inquiry and where it came from before introducing the inquiry itself. So really the idea behind this was really kind of inspired by a lot of work that other history teachers were doing. There's the UCL Legacies of British Slavery database that I strongly recommend looking up. You can look at sort of local, what's going on in your area, local slaveholders. But there was also, I went on the HA Teacher Fellowship quite a long time ago now on local history. And one of my colleagues on that was doing a project solely focused on looking at the local history of the transatlantic slave trade, which I found really, really inspiring. It's particularly interesting, I think, for us because Cambridgeshire is just not that obviously relevant to the slave trade. There's no port access or anything like that. So it's not got the same obvious links as, say, somewhere like London or Bristol. But what's really interesting for us is actually a local historian from the University of Cambridge, Martin Daunton, has actually written about this in a blog post. And he called his blog Slavery and Silence. And he basically said in this blog that Black Lives Matter was really important for kind of focusing on the removal of visible markers of, slavery, like statues. But actually, it's actually really important that we also make visible what is currently hidden. And particularly exciting for us is that actually in Cambridgeshire itself, he refers to a particular site where this problem is really, really evident. So basically what he introduced was Chippenham Park. It's about 30 minutes for us away from our school, which is really nice because it is genuinely local. And what's particularly interesting about the site is actually they've actively tried to hide the slavery connections. So this is a screenshot of the history part of their website, and the only reference to slavery on it is right at the end, and it says the house was taken over by a highly successful sugar baron. Now that's quite interesting. They don't even say slaveholder. And interestingly, I emailed them multiple times and I never got a response. So I definitely got this feeling that they were trying to hide the history. It's a wedding venue, it's an events venue, it's not necessarily a historical house you go around. And I think it really shows a great example of how history is constructed, and actually how history is kind of can be controlled to a certain extent, and how a narrative we might receive of a site is actually not necessarily the most kind of accurate one necessarily. What's particularly interesting is actually, even though it describes him as a highly successful sugar baron, he was actually the guy who ran this plantation, John Tharp, was the largest slaveholder in the whole of Jamaica. And given how prominent Jamaica is in the history of the British slave trades, that says quite a deal about him, that is completely hidden. So from this, getting really excited by this kind of site and kind of idea from Martin Daunton, I went along to the Cambridgeshire Archives. I know that's not something that everyone wants to do all the time. I was only there for a few hours, but archivists are like the loveliest people, I think. And when I went there, it became really clear when I was looking in the boxes for John Tharp's records, that it was very, very quickly easy to see that there were lots of sources available, but also clear that some types of sources were less available. So what you could hear in the archive very clearly was John Tharp himself. There were some letters from him, the slave owner, to his own children. And you can see an example on the screen there. There were also letters, it's really exciting for us, is that there's letters from his own ship owner, who was based in Bristol, William Miles, and kind of their kind of economic engagements, their discussion about the business. Very interesting things that they say to each other. And there's also reports from overseers. You can see example right at the top there, just a description of what's happening on each of the plantations in a really general way. There's also a plan for a slave hospital, and it kind of, again, quite interesting for us and for pupils, is there's a list of slaves that they're going to potentially buy at an auction. So it's really clear that there are lots of sources available to find out about the kind of nature of enslavement under John Tharp. However, what was also really clear was the absence of marginalised voices and their sources. There are no sources that say anything that have come obviously from an enslaved person's hand. It has been very much a controlled archive of the kind of business aspects of this plantation. So basically, I came away from this thinking this is going to be a really, really kind of nice inquiry and clear inquiry for our pupils to focus on this site, because it would be a really easy way for us to show pupils how history is really constructed and how archives really control kind of, or have a big impact on what a historian can and can't do. So they could see for themselves. I took lots of photographs and stuff with kind permission of the Cambridgeshire Archives that we can present to students so they can see what is actually available or not. Now, obviously, this led to a sort of thinking about an inquiry question, and we went with this one on the end, which is how loudly can we hear the different voices from the Tharp plantation? We felt this would be a really interesting inquiry question because it enabled pupils to think about how loud some voices were and how some voices are more silenced, as the Martin Daunton quote suggested. This is the overview sheet that we created for pupils. The idea was it's quite a difficult concept to sort of get across, and we wanted to visually kind of represent how loudly each of those voices could be heard. So pupils shade in sort of on the speaker how loudly each voice can be heard at each point and have to justify their choices. By the end of the inquiry, so roughly speaking, we sort of do one per lesson, one group. It's very easy for pupils to see which voices are harder to hear and which voices are easier to hear.
Hi, so just to explain a little bit about how we actually get pupils to do that, and just to say, sorry, my camera isn't working this morning, but so to help them make this judgment, we break down what it really means to be able to hear someone's voice from the past loudly or not. And we do that by giving them 3 categories or 3 prompt questions to think about. So the first thing is we ask them to think about the nature of what the voice is saying. If the voice is very quiet, we tell them you'll only be able to hear about the physical side of their experiences with no insight into like what they actually think and feel about it. If it's louder, there will be information that you can find about their emotions and thoughts and feelings, giving us a fuller picture. So that's one thing. The next is we get them to think about how specific the voice is. Whether it's making big generalizations about the whole group that we're looking at in a particular lesson, or whether it's actually zooming in and giving us really nice details about specific individuals. For example, Tharp here is a really good example of showing how this could look. John Tharp himself, we've just seen there are lots of letters talking about his ideas, his experience, lots of really specific things about him. By contrast, any mention in the archives about the slaves on his plantation, very generalized as a collective, very kind of physical and cold in terms of what is described rather than any insight into their thoughts. Finally, the final question is a bit different. We ask people to think about how far the voices have actually made their way to the present, if at all. So pupils think about whether the voice was recorded in sources which have been seen as important enough to be recorded and preserved, which would make it louder. Or actually, do we have to resort to looking, for example, at different plantations to kind of give us a similar idea? Or do we even find ourselves making lots of inferences based on not that much? Sarah, I'm going to ask that you skip the next slide, if that's okay. Great. So just to give you an example of how this would look in practice, because most of the scheme is very much about kind of the sources available. This is a table that we use with our pupils to explore the different types of sources available when we are focusing specifically on the enslaved Africans on the Tharp plantation. By this point, we've established with pupils that there are no specific sources created by enslaved Africans from the plantation. However, we do want our pupils to know that that doesn't mean that there's no point in trying to hear something about their experiences, especially because that could lead to them thinking that there's no point trying and therefore there's no reason to really think about the experience of these people. So in this table, down the left-hand side, and there is a picture obscuring part of it, but down the left-hand side, there are a wide range of sources or ways of hearing voices. For each one, pupils think about how clearly they enable us to hear the experiences and perspectives of the Africans firsthand. So an example would be looking at the third one down, the practice of Obeah, which was like a spiritual system, which is something we can be fairly sure happened amongst the enslaved Africans on the Tharp plantation. Most of our understanding actually comes from European portrayals of this. So in the image that you are looking at there at the top, you can see that Europeans have done an artistic depiction of this practice. And what we get pupils to think about is actually how this image is presented. It makes it perhaps the practice look quite violent and even potentially a bit barbaric. And pupils really think about, well, the fact that it comes through the lens of these European eyes and that's how it reaches us in the present, perhaps actually makes the voice less clear, less loud, and makes it harder for us to hear the perspectives of the people actually involved. By contrast, on our fourth one down, we've got mention of the Cromanti dance, which again, we are fairly confident was practiced on the Tharp plantation because that's where lots of the people came from who were transported there. This is a dance which has been passed down through generations without any external interference by the way it's being presented by, for instance, Europeans on the plantations. And so because it's being passed down, kept within their own kind of tradition, pupils will be able to talk about and judge how this is perhaps a more direct way of hearing their thoughts and experiences themselves.
So yeah, thank you for listening to our presentation. I'm very conscious of time. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us via Twitter or Blue Sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. I loved the way that you talked about it's like the construction of history as well. You're not just looking at the voices of these people, you're actually looking at how history is constructed and who is allowed to stay in and who isn't. And I think that that's, again, it's really making that that construction very, very visible. And the idea of the fact that history is constructed and people come up with their own narratives really links with what Terry was saying as well, being aware that actually history is not one narrative, it's lots of different ones. So trying to work out what the good ones are is really, really good. So thank you so much for that this morning. Really enjoyable. And again, loads of brilliant things to take away. So we are now going to move on to Lindsay Rawls, who is flying the flag for primary history here today. I don't know about you guys, but I love it when we have a primary historian at Teachers Talk History. It really helps me understand not only my own kids' history education at primary school, but also where the students I teach are coming from and the experience that they've had. And quite often, I'm blown away by how much they are doing in primary history. And Lindsay is going to highlight for us cause and consequence. When you're ready, Lindsay.
Hello there. Okay, so I'm going to talk this morning about history and just kind of give you an insight into how we teach it and how we get the children to understand it. So I always begin by looking at the national curriculum and what that says for primary. So it says to understand historical concepts such as continuity and change, cause and consequence, similarity, difference and significance, and use them to make connections, draw contrasts, analyze trends, frame historically valid questions, and create their own structured accounts, including written narratives and analyses even. So it's about getting the children to use these concepts to answer questions as well, and to actually construct their own argument. At my school, we have developed icons. So when children are being historians in our school, we focus on one of the aspects of disciplinary knowledge, which I've got on here, and we display this at the start of the lesson with the objective. And I think over the last few years, 2-3 years since I introduced this, children have really started to understand these concepts so much more than when we taught it before. And when I've asked them about these things, they've begun to understand that. So we use this little icon, cause and consequence, with the kind of dominoes toppling. And we say this to the children: cause and consequence is that historians can explain why things happened and when and what happened as a result of those events. So it seems pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go through some of the approaches that we use. So the lesson objectives that we use are knowledge-based, but during that lesson we'll say, right, the objective might be, to know why the Romans invaded Britain. The cause and consequence, it's usually quite obvious what the objective is and how it links to cause and consequence, or to know the impact of the Romans in Britain. But we always have this highlighted, and we highlight that alongside the substantive objective that the children are learning. And I think for children, we go from children who are, year 1 children, very young, up to year 6 in our school. So there's quite a wide range, but can be tricky, can be quite a tricky and quite complex thing, especially younger children, to start understanding. So I'm going to go through some ways that we teach it. So one of the approaches this is some work that one of our classes has done, year 3 class, and this is the objective is to know why Boudicca rebelled against the Romans. So children have had some exposition from the teacher, some information, and then they've been able to explain what happened, why it happened, and they've created a storyboard. And then we use in classes STEM sentences so children can structure answers. So I've got here an example: Boudicca rebelled against Romans because I think the most important reason was. Some children would maybe just be able to do that verbally, which is fine. Okay, but also I would maybe hoping that we've got examples in the books. But I know that this is kind of the approach, but getting children to explain and rehearsing it verbally, so they can tell why And so that is like some of our younger children. We've also got approaches for cause and consequence. We've used some other techniques. So, for example, we've used the zone of relevance. Here's one that I've done for Henry VIII, which is why did Henry VIII reform the church in England? And then also Diamond 9. This is quite a good one for consequence, because you can talk about the most impact, the least impact. When we're teaching this, the children need they need some exposition. They need that information. You can't just expect them to remember a big list of facts about what, why did this happen? Why did Henry VIII reform the church? So we give them the reasons. And actually further up school, it's actually about getting the children to kind of justify their reasons, not just, well, can you tell me a load of reasons, but actually, can you tell me, what do you think was the most important reason why this happened? What do you think was, why was this the most important reason? What do you think the most important consequence of the Romans invading was? So actually getting them to discuss that and to talk about that, not just reiterating a load of facts. So this on the zone of relevance is quite nice. I've actually borrowed this idea from another teacher online. But you give the children, you introduce this, and you obviously have some, discussion and some information, telling the story about what's happening. But then you give the children, get them to discuss in pairs, talking to one another. These are the reasons, right? Can you sort them? Which is the most relevant? Which is the least relevant? Which of these reasons is not relevant at all? Okay, and then that can lead to some really interesting discussion from pupils about what they think. The same thing with the Diamond 9. Children work in pairs or in, just in small groups, placing cards, which of these things had the most impact on Britain when, what was the impact of the Romans invading Britain? And, they would have some really good discussion. They might not always agree. So it's kind of enabling that dialogue within classes and enabling that dialogue between pupils, rather than just being given a load of facts to remember and just regurgitate. These ideas as well, these are for sort of Key Stage 2, because that's I teach Year 5, but you could do this for things like the Great Fire of London. You could even reduce for Key Stage 1, reduce the Diamond 9 and actually have less boxes, but have children doing the same sort of task about what were the causes of the Great Fire of London, or what was the most important cause, or what was the impact of it, most important thing that happened because of the Great Fire of London. So you could have, maybe just 5 boxes or 7 boxes for younger children. I've also done in my classes, we've recently done a unit on World War II, so I'm showing you that one now. And one of the lessons that I taught was using sources, but it was to understand why certain places in the Yorkshire region were targeted by Nazi bombers and why other places were left alone. So the children had, this is from one of my children's books in my class, the children had a range of different sources. So they had like 5 or 6 sources. Some of them were pictures, some of them were maps. There were some with, little bits of writing about it from diary entries. And they had to decide actually, why they came there. They looked at the sources. They kind of like discussed this in teams. And then we had actually here true or false box. What, do you think this is true or false? And then at the end, they explained why they thought this happened, why they thought these, the planes and the bombers came to these places rather than to other places. And we always use, and going back to that STEM sentence from the beginning in lessons, we always use STEM sentences so children can, they've talked about it a lot. They know, how to start their sentences. They've got a start, so they're not just, trying to make it up. And then they've been able to write an answer in their book. So I think the Nazis targeted Castlewood because of the coal mines for their ores and valuables. So this child has had a really good understanding of that. I think the Nazis targeted London because there were more water sources, there was more trade. So she's had a really good understanding of that because she's been able to use the sources. But there are lots of strategies it can use. And I think for me as a primary teacher, it's about getting the children to discuss what they're, discuss the reasons why and their opinions. It's not just knowing the factual knowledge. That is important, yes, but it's also discussing the reasons. Why do you think this? Why is that your opinion? Can you justify it? Can you explain why? Why do you think that's more important than others? And actually, these skills, as we build up, it might be very simple when children are in year 1, but as we get further up school, year 5, year 6 can become a lot more complex, and children really can surprise you with some of the justifications they give. And I think it's about developing that dialogue and then being able to justify what they're saying based on this, that gets them ready for Key Stage 3. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I don't know about anybody else, but the level of writing that your students are doing is brilliant. And I know you said you've got the stems and the structures, but I think it really shows what our primary students can achieve. So sometimes we need to make sure that we're not underestimating them when they come to us in secondary. But thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope that made sense.
Absolutely. So just remember, everyone, that slides and recordings will be sent out at the end of this. You can access the recording on the same link once this event has finished, and you will be able to access all of the PowerPoints as well. Some really good ideas coming through, lots of support on the chat, which I know our speakers really appreciate. Some people have never spoken before, so this is really nerve-wracking. So please do, keep that love coming through. And if you've got any questions, please get in touch. So our second main speaker of the day is Catherine Priggs. Now, you will have seen her, I'm sure, around at the moment because she is everywhere in terms of social media and all of the amazing events she's doing. Her blog dropped into my inbox yesterday. So please do give a warm welcome for Catherine, who is going to really place this whole, the thing that I talked about at the beginning. We historians love a good argument, and at the minute people are arguing over substantive versus disciplinary concepts and whether these can be a different thing or they have to be in there together and which one's the more important. And Catherine is very much going to place that into context for us. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Emily. Can I just check you can see my screen?
Yes, that is it.
Perfect. Right, I will kick off. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak. It's an amazing event to put on, and I just want to give a shout out to you and Claire for your super organisation of this event as well. So today's sessions, across the entire day, are all about how we build, foster and expand pupils' disciplinary knowledge through the curriculum. So I thought it might be handy to talk about one really important feature of this, and that's managing the interplay between substantive and disciplinary knowledge. So I'm going to start this session by just unpicking these terms. Hopefully I won't be teaching you to suck eggs, but it's important, I think, to have consensus on that before considering how we manage the interplay between them. And this is obviously crucial for enabling progression in pupils' historical thinking and knowledge. So just to start us off, I think it is important to note that obviously history teaching is really complex because history itself is complex, and I'm using this web here as a metaphor to show this. And when I refer to history, I'm not referring to the past. Clearly, we know this is a very important distinction. I'm talking about the academic discipline of history, the study of the past. History itself is a construct that has been mentioned in a couple of sessions today, one which is made from many interconnected parts. And in schools, we try to communicate the essence of the discipline to pupils by providing them with structures which help them to make sense of history. And it is important to note also.
Can I just jump in? There is a little thing on your screen. If you can just click hide on that, it'll just...
Yeah, lovely.
Perfect. Sorry, thank you.
Not a problem at all. So I think it's also important to note that there are distinctions between academic and school history. So the structures that we use in schools to enable pupils to access history are specific to studying history in schools, and the academic study of history is characterized differently. But back to the complexity of history, to make sense of the past through the discipline of history, our pupils essentially need 3 types of structures. So they need structures to organize information, such as timelines and narratives. They need conceptual structures to think about the past. So ideas such as change, causation, and significance, and we've heard a bit about some of these today. And third, they need a strong sense of how history is created, meaning a working knowledge of sources and interpretation. So just to unpick this a little bit further, understanding the philosophy of history as a discipline is crucial to successful history teaching. And there are two major structural threads that underpin rigorous planning and meaningful teaching of school history. So pupils need knowledge about the past, which we refer to as substantive knowledge. And they also need knowledge about how historians study the past, which is disciplinary knowledge. And these are terms that were originally coined by the fantastic Christine Council in an article that she published in 2018. Any references that I make, I will pull up at the end, so you can go and dig a bit deeper if you so wish. So just a simplification to make clear the distinction between these two types of knowledge, which are central to what I'm talking about today. We can refer to substantive knowledge as know what and disciplinary knowledge as know how. So first of all, substantive knowledge, this is the content that we usually think of when we talk about history. So it's the events, the people involved, the places, and the movements that have shaped our world. And you can see some examples here of substantive knowledge that may or may not crop up on your curriculum. I have some very niche interests in history. Describing substantive knowledge as the content of the past is helpful for distinguishing it from disciplinary knowledge, which we'll come to in a moment. But obviously, without having substantive knowledge of the past, pupils can't truly understand the past. We can't just bombard them at the same time with every event or fact that we know. We need to really carefully select what is most important, or what we think is most important for them to learn at each stage of their education. Now, it's really important to highlight here that selection of content is clearly a huge issue for history teachers to consider, one which we won't discuss today, but one which I think should be guided by clear principles and criteria relating to your curriculum intent and pupil context. And departments will disagree on what should be in a curriculum, and that's totally fine. That's one of the joys of history teaching, I think. But it's important that we've really considered why we are putting what we have put into the curriculum. So to go a bit further, and I think this is really important when we think about substantive knowledge in the history curriculum, I'm going to just think about different categories of substantive knowledge. This is an ongoing conversation in the history subject community and the wider education community, for that matter, as academics and educators continue to theorise about the essence of knowledge in different subject disciplines. So with regards to history education, in 2011, Council classified the types of historical knowledge used by teachers as fingertip and residue knowledge. So fingertip knowledge allows pupils to access topics as they are being taught. And this is knowledge that can be forgotten, so it's not essential for future learning. Residue knowledge is the detail left behind from fingertip knowledge, which over time leaves pupils with a broad historical understanding. And in 2018, Council used the terms core and hinterland, which have obviously, and I'm sure you've heard of them, had a huge impact on history teachers' practice by changing the way in which we consider and distinguish the curricular functions of knowledge. So core content is that what we aim for pupils to retain. So as Council said, the things that can be captured as proposition. And hinterland knowledge is contextual or background detail, which serves the proximal function of enabling pupils to generate and arrive at core propositions. And when planning a history curriculum, it's essential to consider the relationship between core and hinterland. So not just the relationship between substantive and disciplinary knowledge, but also between different types of substantive knowledge. So although pupils can technically forget hinterland knowledge and still achieve the ultimate aims of the curriculum, hinterland knowledge is crucial for facilitating and enabling historical understanding. It's not an optional extra or an anecdote that's told to enliven pupils in a particular lesson. So without hinterland fostering pupils' sense of period and historical perspectives, the core is meaningless. Johnny Grand has written a fantastic blog on this. So he argued that the core is abstract without hinterland, and that hinterland makes meaning of knowledge. So again, I'll pull up a reference to Johnny's blog at the end, but it is worth having a quick read of. So another aspect before we move on to disciplinary knowledge of substantive knowledge is substantive concepts. So substantive concepts are big ideas in history, ideas that pupils return to in different contexts throughout their study of history. The HA defines substantive concepts as those concerned with the subject matter of history, the substance about which students are learning. And the HA also highlight that some are highly specific to period or place. Others can originate in a specific context, but then develop to have wider resonance and use, while others have a wide application, can be applied in many contexts, and are not history specific. And of course, this makes it quite tricky to think about when we're planning for progression in pupils' understanding of substantive concepts. So just some examples of these concepts, you can see on the slide here: class, race, imperialism, revolution, and democracy. These are really powerful tools for understanding the past because they're recurring issues that pupils will bump into through study of different topics. But as I say, they can be very tricky to teach because they evolve over time. So a term like parliament or revolution will mean very different things depending on the period. So for example, the concept of revolution will look very different to pupils if they're studying the French Revolution as opposed to the Russian Revolution. And as our role as history teachers is to help pupils to see how these ideas change as they progress through their studies. So one key to teaching substantive concepts is repetition. They're really challenging ideas, so pupils need to encounter them multiple times, each time deepening their understanding. And of course, this repetition is necessary because, as I said before, the meaning of them changes over time. So I've also suggested that clearly a solid history education will develop pupils' disciplinary knowledge of how historians study the past. And I'll just go into this a little bit deeper to distinguish it further from substantive knowledge. So development of pupils' disciplinary knowledge will include them understanding how historians identify and use sources of evidence, how they formulate historical claims, and how they support those claims with evidence. And among those conventions are the organizing concepts of the discipline. So these are sometimes referred to as second order concepts. The history teaching community refers to them now often as disciplinary concepts. So these are abstractions that allow teachers and pupils to give shape and meaning to their study of the past and to engage in its interpretation. And obviously you've got them listed here for you. So cause and consequence, change and continuity, similarity and difference, significance, evidence, and interpretations. So clearly I could run a whole session on each one of these, and they need to be understood in their own right. But it's important to understand that these concepts basically shape the way that substantive knowledge is learned about and understood. So just to give an example of that, pupils might look at the causes of the First World War, cause being the disciplinary concept used to study the substantive material, which is the First World War. And obviously, it's crucial that pupils build disciplinary knowledge because this is absolutely key to the manifestation of history in the classroom. So if you do want to look at disciplinary concepts in a bit more depth, I'd like to refer you to the HA site. So the HA basically have a whole heap of resources linked to each of the disciplinary concepts. And I think it's really useful to read some articles from Teaching History to just think about how teachers have wrestled with how to teach these concepts in their own classrooms in response to a particular deficit in pupils' understanding. And you've also got the What's the Wisdom series from the Historical Association, which unpicks these disciplinary concepts individually in much more depth. So finally, onto interplay. I'm just going to take a moment to read an extract from Ofsted's History Research Review, which Tim Jenner wrote in 2021. And he argued for the importance of the interplay between the types of knowledge we have discussed in this session. So Jenner wrote that deploying both substantive and disciplinary knowledge in combination, that's the key thing, is what gives pupils the capacity or skill to construct historical arguments or analyse sources. And this is because knowledge of the past, so substantive knowledge, must be shaped by disciplinary approaches in order to become historical knowledge. So one without the other is meaningless. Similarly, acquiring disciplinary knowledge is made purposeful and meaning to pupils when it's related to particular historical problems where pupils have sufficient knowledge of the period, setting, and topic to reason, to make inferences, and to grasp the terms that others are using in any debate. So just to break that down a little bit further, I'll just simplify that. And I want to just labour this point of why this interplay is so important. It's not enough to teach facts alone. So if we just teach pupils what happened in history, clearly they'll know a lot of information, but they won't really understand how we know that information or how to interpret it. And on the flip side, if we only teach pupils how historians work, they might not have enough content to engage with those methods. And this is why it's really tricky for pupils to understand the essence of the discipline through a what is history inquiry at the start of year 7 without a concrete substantive focus to explore as they do so. So the magic essentially happens when we combine both of these types of knowledge in our teaching, which finally brings us on to how we do that. And it is through the inquiry questions. So inquiry questions are the way to integrate both substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And these are big open-ended questions that can be used to guide pupils through a topic. They make pupils think critically, combining what they know about the past with the methods that historians use to study it. And you've got a couple of references on the slide here. So the Historical Association's What's the Wisdom on Inquiry Questions and Michael Riley's article from 2000 on inquiry questions are excellent starting points for considering these in more depth. So a really good inquiry question should govern learning across a sequence of lessons. It should also plan for progression in pupils' historical thinking across a key stage. And crucially, it should take time to construct. It's something that should be wrestled with. And a couple of things that an inquiry question should not do. So it shouldn't necessarily deal exclusively with one disciplinary concept. I think in the past there was a tendency to try and do this, but of course, historians don't write history by only looking at one of these abstractions. They look at lots in combination. And inquiry questions should also not be broken down, or don't need to rather, sorry, be broken down to individual questions to accompany each lesson. I used to do this myself, but I find it sometimes overloads the pupils. So crafting inquiry questions requires teachers to have detailed knowledge of the period, really strong disciplinary awareness, and crucially, knowledge of relevant historical scholarship. So we need to know what historians are arguing about to ask appropriate and historical questions. And this is not only to guide the selection of relevant content and the appropriate simplification of that content for a particular year group or a particular class, but also to inform the selection of an appropriate disciplinary lens through which pupils should study the past. So just refer briefly back to these categories of substantive knowledge that I drew upon. A history teacher's knowledge supplies the fingertip knowledge necessary to enhance and furnish pupils' historical understanding and enables them to define the core knowledge that pupils should take from an inquiry. So we're going to have a brief look at what this looks like when it's done well. Some of you may have read this article or read the article from which these figures are taken in Teaching History 177 by David Hibbett and Zeba Patel. It's a really fantastic article that changed my thinking about how we can really use an inquiry in depth to engage pupils with the disciplinary concept of interpretations. So David and Zeba basically wrote about how their integration of historian Yasmin Khan got their pupils to think more deeply about how historians work, including how they work with evidence. And they wanted to expose pupils to the practical decisions made by historians to move them beyond having simplistic ideas regarding historical accounts. And therefore, the interactions they set up between their pupils and Khan, so they actually got in touch with Khan and asked particular questions about her historical method, filmed it, and then showed these in lessons. And they actually got their pupils to ask these questions. So this allowed their pupils in lessons to consider the methodological choices that shape an academic historian's argument. So if we just take a moment to have a look at the specific inquiry question that David and Zeba were working with, which you can see in figure 2 on the top right-hand side of the slide, how does the historian Yasmin Khan use evidence to reach conclusions about experiences of the Second World War? So you'll see here that obviously a focus on interpretations is solidly established. And what's so clever here, I think, is that pupils are not solely using this historian to furnish their historical understanding. They will obviously do that throughout the inquiry, but importantly, they were prompting their pupils to think about Khan's personal choices for the construction of her scholarship in order to capture the social effects and diverse perspectives that were central to her work. So it's a really well-considered interpretations inquiry through which pupils will study experiences of the Second World War, which is the substantive focus. And as I mentioned before, an inquiry question doesn't have to and likely will not have one disciplinary focus. Of course, we can signpost that within the inquiry question itself, but likely pupils will draw upon other disciplinary lenses through their study of each inquiry question. So in this example, pupils will look at the Second World War through a secondary focus of diversity or similarity and difference. So I'm going to just draw upon Christine Council again to just demonstrate that it's really important that we get the inquiry questions right because they provide the rigor. So Christine Council in Teaching History 135 wrote a cunning plan on dodgy generalizations that she gave to her pupils to get them to build specific statements about the past. And we're going to now just very briefly play the dodgy inquiry question game. So there are some examples here that I'm using from Hugh Richards' One Big History Department post on inquiry questions. I'd like you to just take 30 seconds to have a scan of these, which are good and which are dodgy. And the good ones, as you find them, have a think about how they manage the interplay between the substantive and the disciplinary. So I'll just give you a few seconds to have a look at those. Okay, so obviously these are up for discussion, really. If you do have a look at Hugh's post that describes some of these, you'll see them unpicked in a bit more depth. But I'll just go through them and just highlight which ones are I would say are dodgy and which ones are really good inquiry questions. And I'll start with obviously what caused the French Revolution. Now, this is fine as an inquiry question. It's not dodgy. It's not exciting, is it? But it does the job. There's a substantive focus and there's a disciplinary focus. So pupils are looking at the French Revolution through the concept of the disciplinary concept of causation. And I wanted to put that in there because they don't have to be inventive, but often history teachers like to try and make them really pithy. And then you've got where was the early medieval period a golden age, which is a really good inquiry question. This was used by Tim Jenner, and he wanted to improve curricular scope by asking this question. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? Is dodgy. So it's begging pupils to make a moral judgment on a part of the past. So it's ahistorical. Who were the Chartists? This was asked by Jacob Olivey, I believe, and it's referenced in What's the Wisdom on Inquiry Questions. And it's looking at how we can characterize the Chartist movement, which is really important for understanding the nature of the Chartists and why they emerged in the 19th century. Nasty, stupid and stagnant, is this a fair summary of people and their lives in the Middle Ages? This was asked by Ian Dawson, and he is tackling the issue that is pupils having a very simplistic understanding of the medieval period, which is my area of specialism. He's written a whole blog on this, which is referred to or linked to in Hugh's article, and it's well worth a read. Was Cromwell a hero or a villain? Similar questions can be asked about Henry VIII. And these types of questions are dodgy. Again, we're asking our pupils to make judgments when we ask questions like this based on morals and not really based on authentic historical questions. Rachel Foster asked, what's the story of the women's suffrage campaign? So this inquiry question is underpinned by scholarship. You've got another dodgy one here for similar reasons that I've described before. Who killed JFK? I spoke to someone who visited a school, and for an entire term, their school actually addressed this inquiry question. But again, there is actually, I also had a look on the TES last night, and there are some inquiries where pupils are mini detectives trying to find this out. They shouldn't have to do that. If we do have all the archival footage, archival evidence released shortly. But again, it's not a historical question. And then finally, Kate Smee asked, how should we remember the 60s in Bristol? Which is a great question to use significance as a lens to think about how we should remember a particular period. So just to conclude, couple of things. First of all, it's really important to consider inquiry questions as a package, which Ollie Scott called for in his session earlier on. So cumulatively, inquiry questions should plan for progression in pupils' substantive and disciplinary knowledge across a key stage. And as Michael Riley argued, we should consider, therefore, what our inquiry questions look like collectively. So establishing a curriculum-wide relationship between the substantive and disciplinary is complex. There's no blueprint for selection of content, and neither is there a blueprint for how pupils' disciplinary knowledge should progress. And therefore, teachers need to give consideration to three things. Firstly, how one layer of substantive knowledge will accelerate another. Secondly, how and when pupils' disciplinary knowledge is developed. And then thirdly, how substantive knowledge is used to support pupils' learning of disciplinary knowledge. So a couple of questions for you to take away from this session. It might be handy for you to think about how well do you currently blend substantive and disciplinary knowledge in your own teaching? And with a view to thinking about that, you might want to consider, therefore, how robust your inquiry questions are. So in conclusion, the integration of substantive and disciplinary knowledge is essential for pupils developing a deeper and more meaningful understanding of history. It's not just about teaching events or facts, it's about helping pupils to understand how historians make sense of the past. So by carefully planning how we blend content and methods, we can guide our pupils to think critically and engage with history as a discipline, not just a subject to memorize. There are no quick wins, I don't think, when it comes to resolving the relationship between the substantive and the disciplinary in a curriculum. But I think this is also part of the joy of curriculum construction in history. So wrestling with the ideas and issues that we've explored today is exactly what departments should be doing. And an excellent history curriculum is in part a product of this thought process. So there are some references here for things that I've referred to throughout the this session. Please do just drop me a line on Blue Sky or Twitter or whatever if you'd like these references. And thanks so much for listening.
No, thank you so much for coming along today. You've really placed that substantive and disciplinary knowledge in context there. And I think there's so much that people can go away and think about and take back to their departments and discuss. Like just looking at like the inquiry questions, some of them are so amazing. And I'm like, I want to do that one, but I want to do that one. And there's so much, isn't there, for us to pick from. We're so lucky to have such a rich and very generous teaching community.
Thanks so much, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so we are on to our final two speakers of today. So we have got two more speakers coming up today. One is going to talk to us about British Empire units, something that's come up a few times today in terms of how do we approach this in our disciplinary concepts, or versus this good and bad history and all of those things. And also we are going to have, for all you Elizabeth teachers out there, we have got a real treat coming up in terms of Pete Jackson's going to talk to us about Hardwick Hall. Just a reminder that if you are posting, please post on our socials and use our chat at #TTRhistory. Also, please do get yourself signed up. We can see that there are a few ticket sales have gone on today. So thank you very much to those of you who are signing up to come and see us live in Manchester as well. Remember, that is a whole day event. It has got a whole day of history planned amongst the amazing keynote speakers that we have. And we also, it's always just great to see everybody in person and have lots of fun. If you want to speak at that event, we have a couple of slots left available. But if you want to speak at other events later on in the year, then get in touch as well. We currently have over 300 people online. So hello, everyone. Those of you who have joined us later on in the day, it is great to see you there. And the other thing to remember is that slides and recordings will be available at the end of this session. So let's get Sean online. He came and spoke to us as well in September. So thank you for returning to this online one. In my sneaky peek of your presentation, I thought this was a really innovative way to look at the British Empire. So it's definitely one that I'm going to be looking at in more depth.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Okay, I'll quickly share my screen. Hopefully this...
Yeah. When you share, it'll probably come up with a little thing, and just make sure you click hide on that.
Is this showing now? Is this? Sorry, let me just double check if this is. Okay.
Emily, you're muted.
Why is this not
Yeah.
working? Sorry about that.
It's right, don't worry about it. Sometimes the tech works and sometimes it doesn't. I think we've got them as well, so I can always pop them on for you. So just waiting for those slides to upload. We love technology, and it's gone so well so far today. So we knew that it would have to fail.
Yeah, I had to be the one just to.
Yeah. Oh no, don't worry about it. I was convinced it was going to be me at some point. So don't worry about it at all. It's absolutely fine. I'm trying to process them as well as they upload. There's been such great things today. Like there's been so much sharing of amazing things. Right. Can you control that?
I can't actually control that, no.
I mean, you can tell me next slide and I can do that for you.
Okay, sure. I think we'll have to do this then. Okay.
Let's roll with that. I'll disappear, but I will be there to do your slides.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks.
Okay. So, right, hi, sorry for that little sort of delay here. So, I'm Sean. I'm a teacher of history at school in Luton. And as you can see, this presentation is on the teaching of the British Empire. Now, this, I must say, was definitely something that's not my sort of forte. It wasn't really my speciality at the beginning of last year. However, I'm glad to say that it is now. Teaching the British Empire, as I've sort of said before on like Twitter or X, on LinkedIn as well, really is very, very complex. One of the first sort of questions, quite simply, is what do we teach? Just next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. So any sort of brief search of the British Empire will give you images like this, for instance. Okay, a huge empire, the world's largest empire, covering so much of the Earth's land surface, controlling so many of the seas, the oceans, the trade routes, the trade networks, and controlling around 25% of the Earth's population at one point. So where do you begin? What part of the globe do you look at? What century? Do you want to look at the moments when Britain first started colonisation? Are you going to look perhaps in the middle, or maybe are you going to look at towards the end? So scale and geography is really what you've got to consider, number one, I would say. And then embrace complexity. To put it simply, British colonial rule looked different in different colonies at different times. There were moments when the British Empire increased, then it got small again, then it got big again, and it's this sort of fluctuation which can be really difficult to teach because it doesn't really follow a clear chronology as other empires or other periods of history, whereas this sort of clear thread or clear picture running through it, that's not really the case of the British Empire. As soon as you embrace complexity, you're actually doing the right thing. And then that sort of links into the summative assessment, and I'm going to look at that later. Now, this is just a short historiography of British imperialism. In no way is this a comprehensive list or a comprehensive view of how British imperialism has been taught over the last few decades, but some of these textbooks come from around sort of the 1970s and 1980s. As you can see, they are similar. Now, a lot of the teaching, a lot of the resources, the textbooks before the 21st century focused on what you can see here. The glorification of the British Empire, the focus on military prowess, the focus on the sort of famous or infamous red coats used in colonial rule. And this is really the typical image before we start to get different ways of scholarship and different perspectives of the British Empire in sort of like the late 1990s, early 2000s. As we've heard before, inquiry questions are some of the most important things history teachers have to consider. And this is actually quite a nice transition from the previous talk from Catherine, who talked about the importance of that interplay between substantive knowledge, disciplinary concepts, and the importance of inquiry questions. Previously, it's not so much a feature now, although it does still happen. Previously, the British Empire has been taught as this sort of good versus bad debate or good versus bad issue. I would argue, as many would, that this is a very reductive form of history practice and history education. It doesn't really get to the heart of what history is about. History is about making complex arguments. It's about nuance. And so this sort of good versus bad, whether you say that, oh, it was good here and it was bad here, is very reductive. And something which we also should consider is that we don't actually really do this for many other topics in secondary history, yet we seem to do it for the British Empire. I know some people might teach the Spanish Empire. I know I do for year 10 when we look at early Elizabethan England. We also look at the Portuguese Empire briefly when we look at the transatlantic slave trade. And we don't have this same issue where we look at good versus bad. Yet for some reason, over the past sort of couple of decades, many history educators have looked at this good versus bad issue when they've looked at British imperialism. And as I alluded to before, the chronology and nature of British imperial history is actually too complicated for this to be a suitable inquiry. A really good case study, which some of you might be wary of, or I might actually teach is the history of the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy is really fascinating when we look at British imperial history because at one point, the British Royal Navy were enslaving Africans. They were forcing them onto slave ships, taking them across the Atlantic Ocean, forcing them to work on plantations in places like the Caribbean and the West Indies. But then after that, the Royal Navy switched its function and was actually stopping the Portuguese and stopping the Spanish from doing that. So there were moments when the Royal Navy and the British government were actively enslaving people, but then there were moments when they were enforcing the abolition. So this good versus bad issue is actually too simplistic to actually put into practice if you're thinking of an inquiry question. So let's look at the most recent scholarship, because this is where we can really start to improve our inquiry question and our schemes of work on the British Empire. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this historian, Safnan Sanghera. He sort of came to sort of prominence a couple of years ago, particularly with his work Empireland, which looked at the influence of imperialism and also migration here in Britain. Yet this book, Empire World, which has just been released in paperback this month, looks at how British imperialism has shaped the globe. This has truly transformed the way in which I have looked at British colonial rule, and I'm going to show you the ways in which it's influenced my practice in some of those individual lessons. So one of the pages, and quite early on in this book, Sangere says this. He says, the British Empire supercharged education in Nigeria and allowed illiteracy to thrive in Iraq out of total self-interest. It displaced and unmoored millions and gave millions of others work and shelter. The British Empire was both haphazard and planned. It was involved intensely in slavery and in the mission of anti-slavery. So really complex, as I've made quite clear so far. So let's look at how we actually go about this. First step in building your scheme of work on the British Empire is to acknowledge the fact that you have to be selective. Now, this can be said with every single scheme of work across every different year group, that you cannot talk about everything. And you've really got to admit this and be selective. Think about which colonies you're interested in and which ones you are perhaps a specialist in. Maybe you want to reflect on some colonies or some lands which you don't really discuss in other year groups. So maybe you want to do that too. So for instance, in my scheme of work on the British Empire now, I spend a lot of time talking about Nigeria and Hong Kong. We don't really look at those countries in other year groups. Then you want to develop your inquiry in conjunction with a specific second order concept. As I said at the start, I was mentioning the word different and difference a lot. So you can probably work out which one I went with. And then you want to use that second order concept as a bit of a torchlight on the history of the British Empire. Know that you can't talk about every colony, but use that second order concept. It could be causation, it could be change, it could be similarity or difference, and use that to guide the rest of your lessons. And then you want to decide those colonies, and you want to be really precise with them. You might want to go big picture first and then look at individual colonies. So as I said, I went with difference. Yet, as Catherine said just before I started speaking, when we look at our inquiry questions, they don't just have to focus on one second order concept. In most cases, there probably will be one obvious one. And in this case, it's similarity and difference. But as you can see here, I've used sources and interpretations in order to meet that other second order concept. And this is the inquiry which I created. And it's how far did colonial rule differ across the British Empire? It's not reductive. It's not that good versus bad issue. It adds nuance. There's a lot of room for criticality, and there's room for students to look at multiple colonies. And so it's a very suitable and it's very engaging inquiry. So yes, this is sort of reiterates what I said before. Complicated enough to avoid reductive interpretations of the British Empire, engages with what historians are currently saying about the British Empire. I showed you Sangere's work before, and what I have found with this inquiry and this second order concept is that it really made myself and my students look at Indigenous people too, because when they were looking at differences in colonial rule, in order to look at differences, they couldn't just talk about 2 or 3 colonies. They had to talk about several. So it was really good to look at loads of different colonies altogether. This is not completed because this is the first time I've taught this inquiry and the first time I've put together a scheme of work on the British Empire. So it's not completed, but this gives you an overview of some of the lessons. The lessons which have been highlighted in yellow are the moments where we explicitly look at the second order concept. And as you can see, there's an end of topic assessment, which comes back to the inquiry. But I scaffold that along the way, and I show them how to compare colonization in Ireland and America. And just as a bit of a side note as well, many people, when they look at the British colonial rule, the first thing they look at are the 13 colonies. Yes, I have a truly comprehensive study of imperialism. We ought to look at Ireland as being England's first colony, and then ultimately you want to perhaps look at the 13 colonies thereafter. We also do the same for the Caribbean and India. At the start of the topic, all students in Year 8 are given this sheet. It's completely blank, and what they will have to do is research the different colonies. We do that. We do a colony per lesson, and then what they'll do is they'll look at Ireland, and then at the end of the lesson or lessons on Ireland, they'll write Ireland at the top of the column, and then they'll go through the different features of colonial rule, and they'll highlight it, they'll tick it. So for instance, this is what they'll have at the end of it. And what this does is, in a very sort of short amount of time, it's very efficient. It gives them a good overview looking at how similar and how different colonial rule was in these different colonies. Of course, this isn't all of the colonies in the British Empire. As I said earlier on, you want to be selective and think about which colonies you'd want to choose. But this is a good selection because, for instance, if you wanted to look at trade, trade is a feature of British colonial rule in virtually all of Britain's colonies. Yet the items which were traded between the 13 colonies in Britain were different to the ones which were traded between India and Britain. So there's, as I said, there's room for nuance as well. Trade is a similarity, but the items or the commodities which were traded were done differently. This is another worksheet as well, which I use in one of my lessons. I know we saw the use of Venn diagrams before, really effective for showing similarity and difference. Perhaps you can also do it for change and continuity if you wanted to look at how the British Empire changed over time. The summative assessment, as I said, returns to back to the inquiry question. The list on the on the left-hand side is the use of those higher order concepts like imperialism, empire, colonies, etc. This is when students will be asked to go back to some of those higher order concepts, they'll complete definitions, and then they'll start to plan their paragraphs. And when they plan those paragraphs, I tell them, make sure you refer to at least 2 colonies, because in order to compare colonial rule, you've got to mention at least 2 colonies in order for that to happen. And on the right-hand side, you've got some sentence starters. All this can be available as well if you want to use these yourselves or perhaps edit them. There's some sentence starters on the right, which will show you how to compare them as well.
That's all the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. That, again, amazing resources to share as well. I really like the concept of looking at the similarity and difference across. And I think similarity and difference is often so confused with change and continuity, but actually can be a really nice way into an inquiry or a really nice way to scaffolding them up. And I love the scaffolding on those worksheets. And again, all of these resources are going to be there on our at the end of today's session. So thank you again, and apologies for the technical mishaps. So those of you who teach Elizabeth at Edexcel or any of the others at GCSE, I'm sure you've been waiting with bated breath for this our final speaker, which is Pete Jackson. He is going to talk about Hardwick Hall, and I've actually had messages from a couple of people saying, "Is this going to be recorded? Because I've just about to start this, or I've just been there with my students," and so they're really keen for this. And Pete does also credit the work of Ben Bassett in this, who is going to be speaking at Teachers Talk Connect in March. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more from the other side of it then. So thank you very much, Pete, and welcome.
Hi there, everyone. I think you can see my my presentation as well. So that's all good. So it should work absolutely fine. Thanks for inviting me on. My name's Pete Jackson. And I'll put my blue sky there. So if anyone wants to connect kind of afterwards and get any of the resources, you can do. So I've been working this year to develop different historical stories in order to deliver GCSE content. We know we've got a lot of content delivering GCSE, but I've found this to be a really effective way in delivering key content. So what I thought I would do is just share for about 10 minutes how I've used the story of Bess of Hardwick. And obviously we've got a picture there of the iconic Hardwick Hall. So I've actually developed this for OCRB, but I think it's a fantastic focus for OCRB. So in terms of our key historical inquiry, we're looking at daily lives. Did people's lives get better in Elizabethan England? And then that topic is taken direct from the exam board. And it kind of like, when I've taught this before, I've kind of taught generically about the rich and the middling sort and the poor. And I've kind of, said, well, the rich showed off their wealth through their houses and that kind of stuff. And it just struck me that if I really kind of use that small story to kind of tell that big picture, then that can be an incredibly useful way. So that's kind of like was my thinking really in developing a story around Bess of Hardwick. And of course, this is really relevant for AQA this year in terms of the historic environment. So actually using a story like this would be a fantastic way of introducing that. In terms of the rationale for Best of Hardwick, I think we focus a lot on retrieval practice, but it's a great way of encoding new historical information because they remember the story really, really well. You're kind of elevating the importance of Bess of Hardwick within that element of looking at daily lives. Obviously, it's a classic Elizabethan prodigy house. I think Bess's own story is a fascinating insight into the Elizabethan gentry, but also an example of a powerful female with her own agency as well. So the story kind of really talks about not just that she made her wealth through the 4 marriages, but the fact that she had her own kind of like her lead mines, the glassworks, for example, really, really interesting. There's loads of talk at the moment, obviously, about world building, and this is great, hopefully, for world building, and an opportunity to really hone in on the great chain of being. And I think someone mentioned in the comments before about Christine Council's Ears Burning, but obviously Christine Council's New Connected Worlds book, I think, has had a really fantastic impact in history teaching in terms of looking at the power of historical stories and just engaging students. Just like, sometimes we can get a bit theoretical about history teaching, but making sure the kids love it, that's really important, isn't it? For sure, and that they're really engaged in it. Now, one thing I would say about historical stories is, and this is where the disciplinary side comes in, it's really important that whilst we're making that historical story, that we stress into the students that this is an interpretation, but also that we make it authentic. So these are some of the different references I use to actually build this historical story. So things like, for example, I ordered the Hardwick Hall guidebook, the National Trust guidebook, from eBay for a really good price of about $3.99. And I discovered actually the precise date that she moved into the home was the 4th of October, 1597. And that there are, there's different kind of viewpoints of whether that might even have been a 70th birthday. So that gave me a nice authentic angle to actually place the story in time, which I think is really, really crucial as well. I went to London over the Christmas holidays. I took my kids to Legoland. So on the way back, we stopped off at the M1's greatest service station, Hardwick Hall. And I took my family around, and they got a bit bored, to be honest. But I think that was also a really important, authentic way to research the story, to actually visit the actual place itself. The other thing I would recommend in developing a historical story is having a critical friend. So some of you are on Blue Sky will know that myself and Ben Bassett have been working together quite a lot on these historical stories. We've been editing each other's stories, being a critical friend. And we've worked on quite a lot of different stories together, really. And I know Ben's presenting in March, and we're both presenting on this at the HA conference in May. So if you are interested in finding out a bit more, sign up for that and come and see me and Ben talk about it there, really. So I thought what we would do now is I would just tell you the historical story. So in terms of putting it together, we're always trying to cut out words from the story to make it not too heavy for the students. We do things like we put line numbers in there, which really helps the flow of the story. And we would kind of set up the task, something like this. So we would say to the students, I would read the story. I would ask my students to track the story and highlight things on the story, annotate the story in terms of how Bess shows off her wealth and power, looking at diversity. So we've got that similarity and difference aspect there in terms of there's obviously Bess's life, but then there's the life of the poor as well. And then just really thinking about how Hardwick Hall visually shows the great chain of being, because it was actually designed to actually show the great chain of being. So the top floor is like, the wealthy bit, the bottom floor, where the great hall is, that's where the servants were living and working as well. So one of the things we do is we give the students a copy of the story and they'll put them in their books. But as we read the story, we will actually have some images to really bring that historic environment alive. And I suppose it's a sense of like a little bit what Mike Hill talks about in terms of using the PowerPoint to really bring out those images and that type of thing. So what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to read you the story, and there will be a copy of the story you can get hold of, I think, at the end, because I've certainly shared them in. So, and then feel free to use it in the classroom, and I'd love to hear how you get on with it. If it goes well, if it doesn't sit well for you, etc. Any opportunities to edit it, it'd be great. So I'm just going to read you the story now, and you can see that I have these little line references on the PowerPoint to remind me when to kind of put the slides on. So here's the story about Bess of Hardwick and Hardwick Hall. It's the 4th of October, 1597, and an elderly lady is moving into a new home on what may or may not have been her 70th birthday. Perched on a striking position atop a hill in the rolling green hills of Derbyshire sits this grand house that everyone is talking about. It has so much glass that people will coin a rhyme: Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. In a time when glass is a luxury item, this house dazzles like a lantern. Its proud owner is Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, but everyone knows her as simply Bess of Hardwick. Line 9. Bess of Hardwick is no ordinary woman. She is the second richest woman in England. She came from the lower gentry, so how does she now own this remarkable home? She made her riches through 4 strategic marriages. Her 4th husband, George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, left an enormous fortune when he died in 1590, but she mourned little for his passing. Their marriage had been far from happy due to the great sums of money Shrewsbury spent on keeping Mary, Queen of Scots, prisoner, and their remodelling of their home, Chatsworth House. Bess is shrewd, ambitious, and charismatic. She's increased her own fortunes like a modern-day tycoon. She owns flocks of sheep whose wool is destined for the booming textile trade. She owns mines and brick and glass-making factories. She rents land and lends money, and is ruthless to anyone who cannot pay. Hardwick Hall is one of the grandest homes in England. It's set to rival other Elizabethan prodigy houses like William Cecil's Burghley House in Lincolnshire or Edward Phillips' Montacute House in Somerset. Their houses contrast greatly with the small, damp and dark homes of the labouring poor who are only just recovering from the failed harvests of the mid-1590s. They can only dream of such luxury. Bess is processing to her new home accompanied by her 22-year-old granddaughter, Arbella Stewart. Flanked by servants wearing mallard blue livery, stirring music plays to mark the occasion. Bess walks through a grand gatehouse to see her crowning achievement, Hardwick Hall. Hardwick Hall is built in the latest Renaissance style, designed by architect Robert Smithson. Its symmetrical design, towering chimneys and vast windows contrast with the gloomy and dark castles of the medieval period. As she gazes up, she can see the orderly sequence of tall, square towers that crown each corner. Their turrets rise above the main structure. Each tower is capped with a distinctive balustrade, with Bess's initials ES for Elizabeth Shrewsbury. Everyone knows whose house this is. As Bess approaches her house, her eyes trace the grand windows. The lowest floor is used by servants and workers. The middle floor is home to family and contains the private rooms of the family. The top floor is the grandest, with a high great chamber and the long gallery. This is deliberately designed to reflect the great chain of being, a belief ingrained in society that everyone has their place, from the lowliest servant to the grandest noble. Bess knows where she belongs, and it's right at the top. Bess enters her home through the loggia and into the great hall. Here on the lowest floor, servants scurry through the hall. This is where they work, and at night they sleep here on straw mattresses. From here, they can get to the other service rooms like the buttery, pantry and scullery. From the kitchen wafts the smell of roasting meat. Preparations are underway for a great feast in the high great chamber. The sumptuous feast will be served with great ceremony, with exotic foods from faraway lands and washed down with some fine wine from France or Spain. A noise rings out. "Pray silence, my masters!" And the servants, now called to order, cluster together to watch. Bess processes through the great room. On each wall, fires crackle and sparkle. Above the fireplace, Bess of Hardwick's coat of arms are finely worked into the plasterwork, a visual reminder that Bess is in charge of the 30 or so servants at Hardwick Hall. Content, Bess begins to climb the spiralling staircase to the top floor. The majestic staircase winds through the house, forcing visitors to experience the grandeur of each floor. What visitors won't see is a library. Bess doesn't care much for the world of books. She has other ways to show off her importance. Passing the first floor with its private rooms for family members, she ascends to the top floor, the grandest with the state rooms. She passes a table covered by a rare and precious Turkish carpet that is too precious to be actually used as a carpet. Here she passes into the high great chamber, used for entertaining important guests. Above the chimney piece is the coat of arms of Queen Elizabeth I. It's a reminder that she knows and respects the Queen, who once said of Bess that, quote, "There is no lady in this land that I better love and like." From there, Bess strolls into the impressive long gallery. At 166 feet long, it's one of the most impressive long galleries in England. Sunlight streams through vast glass panes, bathing the top floor in a golden glow. Dominating the long gallery are the brightly coloured Gideon tapestries purchased in 1592 from the estate of Sir Christopher Hatton for £325, 15 shillings and 9 pence. At 20 feet tall, they are a visual triumph. Guests will be amazed. Through the windows, Bess looks down on her beautiful symmetrical gardens and the orchard and vegetable garden, which supplies the house with fresh herbs, vegetables, and fruit. As Bess pauses to smile, she knows that Hardwicke Hall is a stage set to impress. Bess still holds out a faint hope that her granddaughter, Arbella, will one day be queen. She's only behind King James VI of Scotland as heir. Whatever happens, Hardwicke Hall is a home fit for a queen. Bess will die in the year 1608, 5 years after Queen Elizabeth I. Her legacy remains today at Hardwicke Hall, reminding people of the sumptuous, grand and impressive lives of the Elizabethan gentry. Okay, so that's the story. So you can see there, it took about 6 minutes to read. And I think one of the pitfalls of a story like this is obviously there's a lot of information. So I think it's really important to discuss with the students and pick out some details from the story. They need to do some work with it. These are probably, I'm not going to read them to you, but these are probably some of the knowledge takeaways that we would want the students to take from this, and then we would get them to do some tasks on that. What I've found in terms of using this kind of approach is that it does make things really, really memorable. You can see that I'm trying to get some other elements within the story. So, for example, I drop in things like the harvest of the 1590s, for example, drop in a little bit about the lives of the servants and the contrast with the lives of the poor, for example. I dip in a little bit with sort of like succession crisis. The Arbella Stewart stuff's a nice connection, for example. Interestingly enough, Walter Raleigh actually went to prison because he tried to get Arbella Stewart on the throne, which is quite a nice link in the future. And also, of course, we mentioned Mary Queen of Scots in there. We just dipped that in as well. So it's kind of like trying to use that story to do the heavy lifting of the curriculum. And certainly we definitely emphasize to the students how that is basically the story is an example of an interpretation. So we do use a little bit of license within it, but obviously it is rooted in the historical sources and the references that we've used to compose the story. So
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pete, for joining us today. That was, I mean, what a lovely way to end today's Teach Me, just by sitting and listening to a story. And I think we have to remember that sometimes in the classroom. I know some of the times when my students are so rapt and listening is when you wind them into that magic of the story. And, you know, and it's a really, truly lovely way to end today. I think if we think about the takeaways from today, we've very much gone down the route of we need to remember that history is constructed and that we construct it, and that we have some responsibility for ensuring that the next generation know that history is a construct and how that comes together and bringing them in. We've also had that idea of making it engaging, in that enthusiasm from everybody today, from all of you watching online, from all of our speakers. That enthusiasm really spills over to the kids, and coming and spending your Saturdays with us online or in person is just amazing. And visual representations, those Venn diagrams, those living graphs, even that little thermometer, just beautiful ways of really pulling our students together and really making them really, really clear and really passing on that passion, because essentially that's why we're all here, because we're all passionate about our subject. So I would like to end by saying a huge thank you to our speakers today for giving us their time and expertise. The willingness of our history community to share with each other astounds me every time we organise an event. Also, thank you to Tom and Claire for their work behind the scenes today. And finally, thank you to everybody who has tuned in today as well. You'll get the recording and all of the PowerPoints, including that brilliant story from Pete, at the end of today. Remember, if you have enjoyed it and found it useful, then do come along to Teachers Talk Connect in March in Manchester. We've got that full day of history speakers. This is not you coming along and there's a couple of hours. It is a full day of history speaking. So please do come along. We have got some table talk formats. So some of our speakers will be in a main room. Others will be more in smaller groups in a carousel format. So you'll get an opportunity to have those conversations about what you hear as well. You can also bring your colleagues, because because we have got strands in English, RS, Maths, Science, Primary and MFL. I think that's all of them. So come along, you know, with your colleagues from your school as well. In terms of Teachers Talk History, we also have an event coming up in either June or July where we will be doing an evening event on So You've Got Gained Time. Do you want some ideas on what to do with it? And we've got some brilliant speakers lined up for that as well. So we hope to see you again either in person or virtually. So the only thing that remains for me to say is, again, a massive thank you to everyone for their contributions and for tuning in today, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.